At 45, your spirit stops chasing and starts seeking truth. Carl Jung's insight. There's a secret Carl Jung kept from young people, not because he was cruel, not because he wanted to withhold wisdom, but because he understood something most therapists, philosophers, and spiritual teachers refuse to acknowledge. Certain truths can only be metabolized by a psyche that has been properly aged, like wine that needs decades in the barrel to become drinkable, like wood that must season before it can hold weight. The human soul requires a specific duration of lived experience before it can handle what Jung called the terrible knowledge of the second half of life. Jung was explicit about this. In his writings, particularly in The Stages of Life, he made a controversial claim that scandalized his contemporaries and continues to disturb modern readers. Thoroughly unprepared, we take the step into the afternoon of life. Worse still, we take this step with the false presupposition that our truths and our ideals will serve us as hitherto. But we cannot live the afternoon of life according to the program of life's morning. For what was great in the morning will be little at evening, and what in the morning was true at evening will have become a lie. Notice what he's saying here. This isn't a gentle suggestion. This is a declaration of psychological warfare between two fundamentally different life assignments. The person you were at 25 and the person you must become at 45 are not evolutionary continuations. They are revolutionary opposites, and the bridge between them is constructed from the corpse of your former identity. But here's what Jung knew that makes this even more unsettling. You cannot tell a 25-year-old this truth. They are constitutionally incapable of understanding it, not because they lack intelligence, but because their developmental task, their sacred assignment from the unconscious, is to build the very structure that must later be demolished. They must construct the ego fortress that will eventually become their prison. They must perfect the mask that will eventually suffocate them. They must chase the achievements that will eventually reveal themselves as hollow. This is the forbidden threshold. And if you're 45 or approaching it, if you're reading these words and feeling a strange mixture of recognition and dread, congratulations. You've arrived at the doorway Jung spent his entire career trying to describe. The question is no longer whether you'll cross this threshold. The question is whether you'll cross it consciously or be dragged across it screaming. Let me tell you what happens at 45 that makes this moment so uniquely dangerous and so uniquely sacred. Something shifts, not gradually, not subtly, but with the force of tectonic plates rearranging beneath your psychological foundation. Neuroscientists are beginning to document what Jung understood intuitively. The brain undergoes a fundamental reorganization in middle age. The default mode network, the neural architecture responsible for self-referential thinking, for maintaining your sense of continuous identity, begins to restructure itself. Your hormones shift, your telomeres shorten, your cellular intelligence starts whispering a message that your ego refuses to hear. This body is finite, this life is singular, and the script you've been following was written by people who are already dead. Jung called this the biological spiritual convergence. Modern psychology tries to sanitize it with terms like midlife transition or developmental crisis, but Jung was more honest. He said this was the moment when the self, that vast transpersonal intelligence that orchestrates your life from beneath consciousness, stops being polite. The self has been patient for decades while you built your career, accumulated your possessions, perfected your social performance, and convinced yourself that external validation would eventually translate into internal peace. The self has watched you sacrifice your authenticity for approval, your creativity for security, your depth for convenience. And now, at 45, the self stages a coup. This is why Jung deliberately withheld certain teachings from younger people. He knew that if you tell a 25-year-old that everything they're striving for is ultimately meaningless, you don't liberate them, you destroy them, because they haven't yet built the ego strength necessary to survive ego dissolution. They haven't accumulated enough psychological capital to spend it on transformation. They're still in what Jung called the morning of life, where the developmental imperative is expansion. Expand your influence, expand your resources, expand your territory, expand your identity. But at 45, the imperative inverts. The psyche shifts from expansion to contraction, from accumulation to distillation, from building to becoming. And this shift is non-negotiable. You can resist it, certainly. You can pour increasing amounts of energy into maintaining the life-morning illusions, chasing younger partners to feel vital, pursuing new achievements to feel relevant, clinging to the ideals and ambitions of your youth like a drowning person, clutching debris. But the resistance only amplifies the suffering. Jung saw this pattern repeat endlessly in his clinical practice. Successful men and women in their 40s and 50s would arrive at his office in Zurich, confused and ashamed, reporting the same inexplicable symptoms: profound fatigue despite medical health, existential emptiness despite worldly success, mysterious ailments that seemed to emerge from nowhere, relationships that suddenly felt hollow, achievements that tasted like ash. They would say things like, "I should be happy. I have everything I worked for. Why do I feel like I'm dying inside?" And Jung would recognize immediately what was happening. These weren't symptoms of depression, though they mimicked it. These weren't signs of failure, though they felt that way. These were initiation signals. The psyche was trying to kill the false self to make room for the true self. The persona, that carefully constructed social mask you've been wearing and maintaining for decades, was being forcibly removed. And the process felt like suffocation because, in a sense, it was. You were suffocating. But what was dying wasn't you. It was the lie you've been living. This is the secret Jung kept from young people. Your first 45 years were a preparation for a life you haven't started living yet. Everything you thought was the destination was actually the training ground. Every success, every failure, every relationship, every loss, these were all curricula designed by the unconscious to prepare you for the real work of the second half of life. And that work is not about achieving more. It's about becoming who you actually are beneath all the achieving. Let me be specific about what this threshold looks like when you cross it. First, you'll notice that external validation stops working. The promotions, the compliments, the social media metrics, the material acquisitions, they start to feel like counterfeit currency. Your psyche stops accepting payment in these forms. You've been running on this fuel for decades, but now the tank won't take it anymore. This isn't because you've become cynical or jaded. It's because your value system is being forcibly updated by the unconscious. Second, you'll experience what Jung called the return of the inferior function. Whatever psychological capacities you neglected in the first half of life, because they weren't valued, because they weren't practical, because they didn't fit your persona, those capacities suddenly demand attention. If you've been ruthlessly logical, you'll be flooded with irrational emotions. If you've been endlessly nurturing, you'll discover rage. If you've been charismatically extroverted, you'll crave solitude. This isn't random. The psyche is demanding wholeness, and wholeness requires integrating what you've been suppressing. Third, you'll encounter synchronicities, those meaningful coincidences that Jung studied extensively. The world starts reflecting your internal state back to you with eerie precision. You think about someone and they call. You need specific information and a book falls off the shelf. You're wrestling with a question and a stranger says something that answers it. This isn't mystical nonsense. It's the psyche's way of showing you that the boundary between inner and outer reality is more permeable than you thought. You're not a separate self navigating an indifferent universe. You're a node in a vast web of meaning, and that web responds to your psychological state. But here's the dangerous part, the part that makes Jung's secret so potent. If you're under 45 and you force your way into this knowledge prematurely, you risk what Jung called inflation, a psychological state where the ego identifies with the self and becomes grandiose, believing it has transcended normal human limitations. This is why spiritual communities are filled with young people claiming enlightenment, why self-help culture is saturated with 20-somethings selling secrets to transformation they haven't actually lived through. They've accessed the language of the second half of life without having paid the existential dues required to embody it. Jung was adamant. You cannot skip stages. The ego must be built before it can be transcended. The persona must be perfected before it can be recognized as performance. You must thoroughly inhabit the illusion of separateness before you can experience the reality of interconnection. This is why authentic spiritual teachers are always older. This is why genuine wisdom traditions have always honored elders. Not because old age automatically confers wisdom, but because certain psychological capacities only emerge after decades of living have exhausted the ego's strategies for avoiding truth. So if you're 45 or beyond, and you're feeling that strange mixture of terror and possibility that characterizes this threshold, understand this. You're not having a breakdown. You're having a breakthrough that feels like a breakdown because your entire psychological operating system is being upgraded. The person you thought you were, that collection of achievements, relationships, and social identities, is being revealed as provisional, as a necessary stage, but not an ultimate destination. And here's the promise Jung made to those who consciously cross this threshold. On the other side of this death is a life you cannot imagine from your current position, a life where your actions flow from essence rather than obligation, a life where your relationships are based on authenticity rather than performance, a life where your work expresses who you are rather than who you think you should be, a life where the constant, exhausting effort of maintaining the false self is replaced by the energizing simplicity of being the true self. But first, you must be willing to let the false self die. And that death is not metaphorical. It's felt as real grief, real loss, real terror. Because when your identity dissolves, even temporarily, you experience what mystics call the dark night of the soul, and what Jung called the confrontation with the unconscious. You will come face to face with everything you've been avoiding, your unlived life, your shadow, your repressed desires, your authentic longing, and you'll realize that the life you've been living was, in many ways, a defense mechanism against the life you were meant to live. This is why Jung never told young people this secret, because they would either dismiss it as depressing pessimism, or worse, they would try to skip ahead, abandoning the necessary work of the first half of life in pursuit of some premature transcendence. But you, if you're at this threshold, you've done that work. You've built the structure. You've achieved the achievements. You've played the game according to the rules. And now, finally, you're psychologically ready to hear the truth. The game was rigged from the start, not by malicious forces, but by the necessity of your own development. You had to believe the game was real in order to play it fully, and you had to play it fully in order to earn the right to see through it. Comment below with your age and whether this resonates with something you're experiencing, because if you're feeling this threshold opening beneath you, you're not alone. You're part of an archetypal pattern that has been repeating since consciousness first emerged in the human species. Every great wisdom tradition has documented this passage. Every mythology contains stories of the hero's descent into the underworld at midlife. Every authentic spiritual teaching points to this threshold as the gateway to genuine transformation. The afternoon of your life is waiting, but it's not waiting patiently. It's pulling you forward with increasing force. You can resist it and experience the resistance as crisis, or you can surrender to it and experience the surrender as initiation. Either way, the threshold will be crossed. The only question is whether you'll cross it consciously, with courage and curiosity, or whether you'll be dragged across it kicking and screaming, clinging to the wreckage of your mourning identity. Jung's secret, the one he kept from young people, is this: at 45, your spirit stops chasing and starts seeking truth. Not the truth out there in books or teachings or external validation, but the truth of who you are beneath all the chasing. And that truth, once glimpsed, once tasted, once allowed into consciousness, will ruin you for the life you've been living. It will make continuation of the persona impossible. It will demand that you become real, even if becoming real means disappointing everyone who preferred your performance. This is the forbidden threshold. Welcome to the afternoon of your life. Let's see if you're brave enough to live it. Let me tell you about Michael, 47 years old, partner at one of the most prestigious law firms in Manhattan, corner office with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Central Park. 6-figure salary that became 7 figures 5 years ago. Beautiful wife, 2 children in private schools, summer home in the Hamptons. By every external metric, Michael had won. He had achieved the American dream with such precision that he could have been a case study in success literature. So why was he sitting in his BMW in the parking garage at 2 in the morning, unable to go home, unable to go back to the office, unable to move, tears streaming down his face for reasons he couldn't articulate? This wasn't the first time. It had been happening with increasing frequency over the past year. These moments of complete existential collapse would ambush him at random, during a client meeting, at his daughter's soccer game, in the middle of sex with his wife. He would be performing his life perfectly, and then suddenly, without warning, he would feel himself observing himself performing, and the performance would feel utterly hollow, like watching an actor play the role of Michael and watching that performance with a mixture of pity and disgust. He went to his doctor, convinced something was physically wrong. The tests came back perfect. Better than perfect, actually. His blood work indicated the health profile of someone 10 years younger. He tried working harder, thinking maybe he was bored. Maybe he needed a bigger challenge. He took on a case representing a Fortune 100 company in a billion-dollar merger. The stakes were thrilling for about a week. Then the hollowness returned, deeper than before. What Michael didn't understand, what nobody told him because nobody knew how to tell him, was that he wasn't sick. He wasn't depressed in the clinical sense. He wasn't failing. He was receiving a message from his unconscious, and the message was simple and devastating. Everything you've been chasing for 25 years was a lie, and you've just spent 2.5 decades perfecting your pursuit of something that never existed. This is what Jung called the persona's lie, and it is perhaps the most painful realization of the midlife threshold. The persona in Jungian psychology is the mask you wear to interface with society, the carefully curated version of yourself that you present to the world. Jung chose the term deliberately. In ancient Greek theater, persona referred to the masks actors wore to indicate their roles. But here's what Jung understood that most people miss. The persona isn't just about how you present yourself to others. It's about how you present yourself to yourself. For the first 45 years of life, the developmental task is to build a robust persona. You must learn to function in society, to meet expectations, to develop competencies, to establish yourself in the world. This requires a certain amount of self-deception. You must convince yourself that the role you're playing is who you actually are. The lawyer must believe he is fundamentally a lawyer. The mother must believe she is fundamentally a mother. The entrepreneur must believe he is fundamentally an entrepreneur. Because if you're consciously aware that you're performing a role, you can't perform it with the conviction and energy required to succeed. So the psyche does something ingenious and ultimately destructive. It merges your identity with your persona. You stop experiencing yourself as a person playing the role of X and start experiencing yourself as X. Your job title becomes your identity. Your social status becomes your worth. Your achievements become your proof of existence. And every validation from the external world, every promotion, every compliment, every envious glance reinforces the lie. This is who you are. This is what matters. This is what will make you fulfilled. Jung watched this pattern repeat endlessly in his practice. He noticed that the people who were most successful in conventional terms, the ones who had most thoroughly mastered their personas, were the ones who experienced the most catastrophic midlife collapses because they had invested everything in the persona. They had sacrificed everything authentic for the sake of perfecting the performance. And at midlife, when the unconscious withdraws its support for the persona and demands genuine selfhood, they have nothing underneath. The performance is all they have. This is Michael's situation, though he doesn't know it yet. He's spent 25 years becoming the perfect lawyer, aggressive in court, strategic in negotiations, charming with clients, dominant with subordinates. He's won case after case, accumulated accolade after accolade, moved up every ladder available to him. But here's what nobody told him. He wasn't becoming himself. He was becoming what his father wanted him to be, what his law school professors praised, what his partners rewarded, what his wife admired, what society valued. Layer by layer, year by year, he buried his actual self under the accumulated weight of external expectations. And he did it so thoroughly, so successfully, that he forgot there was anything underneath to bury. Now, at 47, his unconscious is staging a rebellion. The psyche has tolerated this imposture for decades because it was developmentally necessary. But there's a biological clock in the unconscious, and when it goes off, usually around 45, the psyche stops cooperating. It withdraws the life force from the persona. Suddenly, activities that once felt energizing feel depleting. Achievements that once felt meaningful feel empty. Relationships based on persona-to-persona interaction start to feel like elaborate games of pretend. Jung described this using a powerful metaphor. Imagine spending 25 years climbing a ladder with absolute dedication and skill. You're ascending higher and higher, congratulating yourself on your progress, using every technique you know to climb faster and more efficiently. Then you reach the top and discover that the ladder has been leaning against the wrong wall the entire time. Everything you thought was bringing you closer to fulfillment has actually been taking you further from it. This is the unconscious lie, the belief that external achievement will produce internal peace, that accumulating enough success, enough wealth, enough status, enough approval will eventually translate into a sense of wholeness and meaning. It's a lie that everyone participates in because in the first half of life, it appears to be true. When you're 25 and you get the job you wanted, you feel fulfilled for a while. When you're 30 and you buy the house you dreamed of, you feel accomplished for a while. When you're 35 and you receive the recognition you sought, you feel validated for a while. But the for a while gets shorter and shorter. The satisfaction derived from external achievement has a half-life, and each successive achievement produces a smaller dose of fulfillment that lasts for a briefer duration. By the time you reach 45, you're on a hedonic treadmill that's accelerating but going nowhere. You need bigger and bigger achievements to feel smaller and smaller moments of satisfaction. This is when people make desperate moves. Affairs with younger partners to feel alive again. Reckless career changes to feel purposeful again. Extreme sports or addictions to feel anything at all. What they don't understand is that the problem isn't the insufficiency of their achievements. The problem is that achievement itself, external validation of any kind, is the wrong currency for the second half of life. It's like trying to buy groceries with monopoly money. The money looks real, you've accumulated a lot of it, but the store won't accept it because it's not actual legal tender. Similarly, external validation is accepted by the persona but rejected by the self. The persona thrives on approval, status, and recognition. The self doesn't care about any of that. The self wants authenticity, depth, and meaning. This is why Michael's crisis feels so confusing to him. If he were failing, the solution would be obvious. Work harder, achieve more, climb higher. But he's not failing, he's succeeding spectacularly, which means the solution isn't more of what he's been doing. The solution is to stop doing what he's been doing and start doing something he's never done, living from his actual self rather than his performed self. But here's the terrifying part. Michael doesn't know who his actual self is. He's been playing the role of successful lawyer for so long that he has no memory of who he was before he assumed that role. When he tries to imagine life without the law, his mind goes blank. When he tries to imagine what he actually wants, independent of what he should want, he feels nothing but anxiety. His entire identity is wrapped up in his professional persona. Without it, he's not sure he exists. This is what Jung meant when he said the first half of life requires building the persona, while the second half requires dismantling it. But most people don't dismantle it, they just renovate it. They switch careers but keep the same persona-driven orientation. They leave one relationship and enter another, but recreate the same persona-based dynamics. They move to a new city, change their appearance, adopt new hobbies, but they're still fundamentally living from the persona, still seeking external validation, still operating from the unconscious lie that fulfillment comes from outside rather than inside. The truth Jung was pointing to is more radical. At midlife, you must psychologically die to who you've been pretending to be in order to live as who you actually are. This death is non-negotiable. You can delay it, you can resist it, but you cannot avoid it, because the unconscious has a timeline, and when that timeline expires, the psyche forces the issue. This is why midlife crises often involve such dramatic external changes: divorces, career explosions, geographic relocations. People are trying to outrun their internal transformation by creating external chaos. But Jung warned that external changes, without internal transformation, just recreate the same problems in new environments. If you leave your marriage without doing your shadow work, you'll attract another partner who triggers the same patterns. If you quit your job without examining your persona, you'll build another career that imprisons you in the same way. The unconscious doesn't care about your external circumstances. It cares about your consciousness. It wants you to wake up, and it will keep creating crises until you do. So what was Michael chasing all those years? What is anyone chasing when they orient their entire life around external achievement? Jung would say they're chasing the phantom of the ego's idea of success, a culturally conditioned image of what a successful life should look like. They're pursuing the parents' approval they never fully received. They're compensating for childhood wounds by proving their worth through achievement. They're trying to outrun the fear of insignificance by becoming significant in society's eyes. But here's what makes this tragic. None of that chasing brings them closer to the actual goal, which is selfhood. Jung defined individuation, the central task of the second half of life, as becoming who you actually are, not who your parents wanted you to be, not who society rewards you for being, not who your persona has convinced you that you are, but who you are beneath all of that, your authentic essence, your true nature, yourself with a capital S. And the devastating irony is that the more successful you are at building your persona, the further you get from yourself. Michael is a perfect example. His professional success is the measure of how thoroughly he has abandoned himself. Every accolade is evidence of his self-betrayal. Every achievement is a brick in the prison he's constructed around his authentic being. Now his unconscious is demanding payment. The bill has come due for 25 years of self-abandonment. And the currency required is not more achievement, but rather the courage to face the question he's been avoiding his entire adult life. If I'm not a successful lawyer, who am I? That question terrifies Michael more than anything he's encountered in his professional life, because the answer might be, I don't know. And if he doesn't know, then he'll have to find out. And finding out means dismantling everything he's built, questioning everything he's believed, and potentially discovering that the life he's been living, the life everyone celebrates, the life he's sacrificed everything to create, was never his life at all. This is the second layer of the unconscious lie. Not just that external achievement will bring fulfillment, but that the path you're on is the path you chose. Most people sleepwalk through the first half of life, unconsciously absorbing and embodying the expectations of their family system, their culture, their social class, their historical moment. They make choices that aren't really choices, but rather unconscious capitulations to collective programming. Then they spend decades defending those choices, because admitting they weren't truly chosen would mean confronting the reality that they've been living someone else's life. Jung observed this with unsettling clarity. He noticed that the most defended personas belonged to people whose entire identity was built on choices they never consciously made. The person who became a doctor because their parents were doctors. The person who pursued wealth because their childhood was defined by scarcity. The person who prioritized family because they were shamed for being selfish. These aren't authentic choices. They're unconscious reactions to developmental circumstances. And the tragedy is that society rewards these unconscious choices if they happen to align with cultural values. Michael is celebrated for his success. His choice to become a lawyer is seen as admirable, mature, responsible. Nobody questions whether it's authentic to him because by conventional standards, it's working brilliantly. Only Michael knows, or is beginning to suspect, that it's killing him. Slowly, invisibly, but definitely. This is why Jung insisted that the afternoon of life requires a different program than the morning. You cannot live the second half of your life according to the operating system that got you through the first half. That operating system was designed for adaptation, achievement, and social integration. It served its purpose. But now it's obsolete, and continuing to use it past its expiration date doesn't just fail to work, it actively destroys you. The unconscious lie Michael has been living is this: if I achieve enough, prove enough, accumulate enough, perform enough, I will eventually arrive at a place of peace and fulfillment. He's been operating from the assumption that life is a destination you reach through sufficient striving, but Jung's message is devastating in its simplicity. There is no destination. There is only becoming, and you've been becoming the wrong thing. Michael doesn't understand this yet. He's still trying to solve his crisis using the tools that created it. He's considering taking on an even more high-profile case, thinking that maybe he just needs bigger challenges. He's fantasizing about leaving his wife, thinking maybe he just needs a different partner. He's researching exotic vacations, thinking maybe he just needs a break. But none of these solutions address the actual problem, which is that he's living a lie so fundamental, so total, that he's mistaken it for reality. The awakening, when it comes, and it will come because the unconscious is relentless, will feel like the ground opening beneath his feet. Everything he thought was solid will be revealed as provisional. Every identity he clung to will be shown to be a mask. Every achievement he accumulated will be exposed as compensation for not living authentically. And he'll have to face the most terrifying truth of all. The life he thought he wanted was never his to want. It was implanted, conditioned, inherited, but never chosen from his deepest self. Comment below if you've ever achieved everything you thought you wanted, only to feel more empty than before. Because if Michael's story resonates with you, you're not alone. You're experiencing what Jung called the divine discontent, the psyche's way of telling you that the persona has served its purpose and now must be transcended. This discontent is divine because it's sacred information. It's your unconscious trying to save you from wasting the second half of your life, chasing the same phantom that consumed the first half. The question isn't whether you'll face this truth. At 45, the psyche ensures that you will. The question is whether you'll face it consciously or be ambushed by it through crisis. Michael is being ambushed, but you, if you're reading this and feeling the first tremors of recognition, you have the opportunity to meet this threshold with awareness, to choose conscious dismantling of the persona rather than waiting for it to collapse catastrophically. The afternoon of your life is calling, and it's asking you to give up everything you thought you were in order to discover everything you actually are. The lie you've been living, the one that says external achievement equals internal fulfillment, is about to be exposed. And when it is, you'll have a choice: defend the lie and suffer, or embrace the truth and transform. Jung would tell you the choice is obvious, but he'd also tell you it's the hardest choice you'll ever make. Because choosing truth means abandoning the only identity you've ever known. And that abandonment feels like death, because in every meaningful sense, it is. Michael's rage came out of nowhere, or at least that's what he told himself. He was in a partners meeting, the kind he'd attended hundreds of times before, when one of the junior partners, a 32-year-old named Kevin, started presenting a case strategy. Kevin was everything Michael had been at that age: ambitious, hungry, confident to the point of arrogance. He spoke with the certainty of someone who believed hard work and intelligence could solve any problem. He hadn't yet learned that life breaks everyone eventually, that the armor of competence is temporary, that the ego's invincibility is an illusion. Kevin said something. Michael can't even remember what, and suddenly Michael felt a surge of rage so intense it physically disoriented him. Not annoyance, not frustration, pure primal fury. He wanted to verbally eviscerate this kid. He wanted to humiliate him in front of the entire partnership. He wanted to destroy the smug confidence that radiated from Kevin's every word and gesture. Michael said nothing. He maintained his professional composure, but his hands were shaking. His jaw was clenched so tight he could feel his teeth grinding, and when the meeting ended, he locked himself in his office and sat there for an hour, heart pounding, trying to understand what had just happened. This wasn't the first time. The rage had been appearing with increasing frequency over the past 6 months. Small triggers would produce massively disproportionate responses. His daughter forgot to take out the trash. He screamed at her for 20 minutes about responsibility and respect. His wife suggested they needed to talk about their marriage. He stormed out of the house and didn't come back for 2 days. A barista got his coffee order wrong. He berated her so viciously that other customers intervened. Afterward, he would feel ashamed. He would apologize, make excuses about work stress, promise it wouldn't happen again. But it kept happening, and each time the rage felt less like something he was producing and more like something that was erupting through him, using his voice and body as its instrument. What Michael didn't understand, what nobody had taught him to recognize, was that his rage wasn't random. It wasn't about Kevin or his daughter or his wife or the barista. It was the voice of his shadow, and the shadow was staging a revolution. Carl Jung spent decades studying what he called the shadow. that part of the psyche containing everything we've repressed, denied, or exiled from consciousness. Most people, when they first encounter Jungian psychology, make a critical mistake. They assume the shadow contains only negative qualities, the anger, the selfishness, the cruelty, the destructive impulses we've learned to suppress. But Jung's insight was more nuanced and more devastating. The shadow contains everything you had to disown, to become the person you thought you needed to be. And for most people, what they've disowned isn't just darkness. It's their vitality, their authenticity, their creativity, their deepest longings. Think about Michael's story. What did he have to suppress to become a successful corporate lawyer? He had to bury his sensitivity, the part of him that felt overwhelmed by human suffering, that cried at movies, that wanted to help people rather than represent corporate interests. He had to exile his creativity, the part that wanted to write poetry, that loved art history in college, that dreamed of being a novelist. He had to reject his softness, the part that wanted to be held and comforted rather than always being the strong one, the provider, the protector. Layer by layer, year by year, he built a persona, the aggressive, strategic, dominant lawyer, by murdering parts of himself. And he didn't do this consciously. He did it because his family system rewarded toughness and punished vulnerability, because his law school environment celebrated aggression and mocked sensitivity, because his firm culture promoted cutthroat behavior and marginalized compassion, because his marriage functioned best when he played the role of strong, successful provider rather than revealing his doubts and fears. So all those disowned parts, the sensitive poet, the compassionate helper, the vulnerable human, got locked in what Jung metaphorically called the shadow realm. And for decades they stayed there, buried under the weight of his persona. But here's what Michael didn't know, what most people don't know. The shadow doesn't disappear when you repress it. It doesn't fade away. It grows stronger. It feeds on the life force you're denying it. And eventually, it demands to be heard. This is what Jung meant when he said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." Michael's unconscious rage isn't random bad luck or a character flaw or poor emotional regulation. It's the shadow using the only language it has, the language of symptom, to communicate a message Michael refuses to hear. You've abandoned essential parts of yourself, and I will not be ignored any longer. Let me explain the mechanism of shadow formation, because understanding this is crucial for anyone navigating the midlife threshold. When you're young, you're born with a relatively complete range of human potential. You have capacities for gentleness and aggression, for logic and intuition, for independence and connection, for wildness and discipline. You're psychologically whole in the sense that you have access to the full spectrum of human qualities. But then you encounter your environment, your family, your culture, your social context, and you quickly learn that certain qualities are rewarded while others are punished. If you're a boy in a traditional masculine culture, you learn that strength, stoicism, and achievement are celebrated while sensitivity, emotionality, and vulnerability are shamed. If you're a girl in a traditional feminine culture, you learn that nurturing, accommodation, and beauty are celebrated while assertiveness, ambition, and anger are condemned. So you make an unconscious bargain with your environment. I will exile the parts of myself that threaten my belonging, and I will develop the parts that ensure my acceptance. This isn't a conscious choice. Children don't sit down and strategically plan their psychological development, but the psyche is intelligent, and it recognizes the survival implications of acceptance versus rejection. So it does what it must. It creates a persona, the acceptable self, and a shadow, the unacceptable self. For the first half of life, this system works remarkably well. Your persona allows you to function in society, build relationships, pursue goals, achieve success. You become increasingly identified with your persona qualities while the shadow qualities remain hidden, even from yourself. In fact, you often lose awareness that you ever possessed those qualities. Michael doesn't think of himself as sensitive or creative or vulnerable. If you asked him, he'd tell you he's just naturally tough, strategic, and dominant. He's forgotten that those qualities were cultivated while others were murdered. But the shadow remembers, and at midlife, around 45, sometimes earlier, sometimes later, but typically during the transition to the afternoon of life, something fundamental shifts. The psyche's priorities change. Instead of continuing to reinforce the persona, the unconscious begins to demand wholeness, and wholeness requires reintegration of the shadow. This is why midlife is so psychologically volatile. It's not just that you're aging or facing mortality or experiencing hormonal changes, though all those factors contribute. It's that the internal civil war you've been successfully suppressing for decades suddenly becomes active conflict. The shadow, which has been growing stronger in exile, begins its uprising. And that uprising manifests in ways that feel deeply destabilizing. For Michael, it manifests as rage. But why rage specifically? Because rage is the voice of all his unexpressed grief, his unacknowledged exhaustion, his denied vulnerability. He's been strong for everyone for decades, for his parents, for his partners, for his clients, for his wife, for his children. He's been the one who solves problems, who handles crises, who never breaks down, and the cost of that strength has been the suppression of his human frailty. The shadow is using rage to communicate what he won't admit. I'm tired. I'm overwhelmed. I need help. I can't keep carrying everyone. But because Michael has no conscious relationship with these shadow qualities, because he's convinced himself he is the strong one, the one who doesn't need help, they can't emerge directly. They have to speak through symptoms. So instead of saying, I'm exhausted and need support, he explodes with disproportionate anger at minor provocations. The anger is a decoy, a distraction from the deeper truth he can't face. And this is how the shadow operates for everyone at midlife. Whatever you've most thoroughly repressed will return in symptomatic form. If you've repressed your sexuality, it might return as an obsessive affair or compulsive pornography use. If you've repressed your ambition, it might return as bitter resentment toward successful people. If you've repressed your creativity, it might return as depression, literally a pressing down of life force that has nowhere to go. Jung had a brilliant diagnostic insight. Look at what you judge most harshly in others, and you'll find your own shadow. This is called projection, and it's the primary mechanism by which the shadow makes itself known. Whatever you've disowned in yourself, you'll perceive with exaggerated intensity in others, and you'll have a disproportionately strong emotional reaction to it. Let's apply this to Michael. Remember his rage at Kevin, the young, ambitious partner? On the surface, Michael told himself he was annoyed by Kevin's arrogance, his overconfidence, his naive belief that hard work guarantees success. But if we look through the shadow lens, something else becomes visible. Kevin represents who Michael used to be, the hungry young lawyer who believed he could conquer the world through sheer competence and determination. Kevin embodies the innocence Michael lost, the idealism he abandoned, the hope he sacrificed. Michael's rage at Kevin is actually rage at himself, at the younger version of himself who made the bargain that led to his current imprisonment. But because he can't acknowledge his own self-betrayal, he projects it outward. He attacks in Kevin what he can't face in himself: the cost of his choices, the death of his dreams, the compromise of his authenticity. This is the shadow's brilliance and its cruelty. It forces you to see in others what you refuse to see in yourself. and it generates such strong emotional reactions that you can't ignore them. The shadow uses other people as mirrors, reflecting back the disowned parts of your psyche with such intensity that you have to pay attention. So what does Michael need to do? What does anyone need to do when the shadow begins its midlife uprising? Jung's answer was clear but difficult. You must turn toward the shadow. You must acknowledge what you've been denying, feel what you've been suppressing, integrate what you've been exiling. This process, shadow work, is the foundation of individuation, and it's non-negotiable. You cannot become whole while remaining divided. You cannot access your authentic self while maintaining your persona's denials. But here's the danger Jung warned about repeatedly. Shadow work without adequate ego strength leads to disaster. This is why this knowledge must be age-appropriate. If you try to integrate your shadow before your ego is sufficiently developed, before you've built a stable sense of self through the persona-building work of youth, you risk what Jung called psychic inflation, or in severe cases, fragmentation. Imagine trying to integrate powerful shadow qualities, rage, sexuality, ambition, creativity, without a stable container to hold them. You'd be overwhelmed. You'd act them out unconsciously, causing destruction in your relationships and your life. This is why Jung insisted that shadow work is primarily a midlife task. By 45, most people have built sufficient ego strength to withstand the destabilizing effects of shadow integration. They have enough life structure, career, relationships, identity, that they can afford to temporarily destabilize those structures without completely collapsing. But even at midlife, shadow work is dangerous. It requires what Jung called moral courage, the willingness to face aspects of yourself that contradict your self-image. For Michael, this means acknowledging that he's not just the strong, successful, dominant lawyer. He's also the scared, exhausted, overwhelmed human who needs help. He's the sensitive poet who got buried under the lawyer. He's the vulnerable man who sacrificed his emotional life for professional success. Acknowledging this doesn't mean abandoning his achievements or his responsibilities. It means expanding his identity to include what he's been denying. It means developing a relationship with his shadow qualities rather than being unconsciously possessed by them. Because here's what Jung understood. When you're unconscious of your shadow, it controls you. When you're conscious of it, you can work with it. Let me give you a practical framework for shadow work, one that Michael and anyone at this threshold can use. Jung called it active imagination, but I'll present it in more accessible terms. Step 1. Identify your projections. Pay attention to your disproportionate emotional reactions to others. When you have a strong judgment, when someone irritates you, disgusts you, enrages you in ways that feel excessive, that's shadow material. Write down the qualities you're judging. For Michael, this might be, Kevin is arrogant, naive, and overconfident. Step 2. Own the projection. Ask yourself, where do I possess this quality, or where have I suppressed it? This is painful because your entire self-image is built on not being that quality. But the shadow works through opposites. Often what you judge in others is what you've exaggerated in the opposite direction. Michael judges Kevin's confidence because he's suppressed his own doubt. He judges Kevin's naivety because he's lost his own innocence. He judges Kevin's ambition because he's exhausted by his own drive. Step 3. Feel the disowned quality. Don't just intellectually acknowledge the shadow quality. Feel it in your body. This is where the transformation happens. For Michael, this means allowing himself to feel his vulnerability, his exhaustion, his grief. Not thinking about these feelings, but actually experiencing them. This often produces intense emotions, crying, shaking, rage, because you're finally allowing yourself to express what you've been suppressing for decades. Step 4. Integrate through action. Shadow integration isn't complete until it changes your behavior. Michael needs to act on his newly acknowledged vulnerability, maybe by asking for help, by admitting to his wife that he's struggling, by setting boundaries with his work, by allowing himself to rest without shame. Each action that honors a previously disowned part of yourself strengthens the integration. Step 5. Watch for projection decrease. As you integrate shadow qualities, your projections will decrease. Michael will find that Kevin stops, triggering him with such intensity, not because Kevin changed, but because Michael is no longer using Kevin as a screen for his own disowned qualities. This is how you know shadow work is succeeding. The external world stops mirroring your internal conflicts with such force. But here's what makes shadow work particularly intense at midlife. You're not just integrating individual qualities. You're facing decades of accumulated denials. Every part of yourself you sacrificed for belonging, for success, for safety, all of it comes rushing back at once. The sensitive poet Michael buried at 22, the creative dreamer he killed at 27, the vulnerable human he exiled at 35. They're all demanding acknowledgement simultaneously. This is why midlife shadow work often produces what looks like personality transformation. People who were rigid become spontaneous. People who were stoic become emotional. People who were accommodating become assertive. They're not changing their fundamental nature. They're reclaiming the parts they were forced to disown in youth. And here's the beautiful and terrifying truth Jung discovered. Your shadow doesn't just contain what you consider negative. It contains your gold, your unlived potential, your suppressed talents, your authentic desires. For Michael, his shadow contains not just his vulnerability, but also his creativity, his compassion, his capacity for joy. These qualities got buried along with everything else that didn't fit the lawyer persona. So shadow integration isn't just about accepting your darkness. It's about reclaiming your light, the life force that's been locked away while you performed your socially acceptable role. When Michael finally allows himself to feel his grief, he'll discover beneath it a wellspring of compassion he thought he'd lost. When he acknowledges his exhaustion, he'll find beneath it a desire to live differently, to use his legal skills in service rather than in corporate combat. This is what Jung meant when he said the shadow is 90% gold. What you've repressed isn't just your flaws, it's your vitality. And at midlife, the psyche is trying to give that vitality back to you. But first, you have to be willing to face the truth that you've been living a partial life, expressing only those aspects of yourself that were deemed acceptable while exiling everything else into darkness. The shadow's uprising, then, isn't an attack. It's a rescue mission. Your disowned self is trying to break free from its prison. And yes, the process is violent. Yes, it's destabilizing. Yes, it threatens everything you've built. But the alternative, continuing to live a divided, inauthentic life for another 40 years, is a fate Jung considered worse than death. He called it the unlived life, and he believed it was the primary source of midlife neurosis, bitterness, and despair. So when Michael feels that inexplicable rage, when he has those moments of complete existential disorientation, when he looks in the mirror and doesn't recognize himself, he's not having a breakdown, he's having a breakthrough. The false self is cracking and the true self is beginning to emerge. The shadow is speaking, and if he's wise, if he's brave, he'll start listening. Comment below with 3 qualities you judge harshly in others, because I guarantee you those qualities, or their opposites, are your shadow trying to get your attention. And if you're 45 or beyond, that shadow is done waiting politely. It's staging a coup. The question is whether you'll recognize it as the ally it actually is, or whether you'll keep fighting it as the enemy it appears to be. Michael doesn't know it yet, but his rage is the voice of his salvation. It's the volcanic eruption that will eventually create new land. But first, he has to stop running from it. He has to turn toward it. He has to ask it what it's trying to tell him, and when he does, when he finally has the courage to face what he's been denying, his entire life will transform. Because that's what happens when you integrate your shadow. You don't just become more complete, you become more alive. The life force that was bound up in maintaining the persona and repressing the shadow becomes available for actual living. You stop performing and start being. You stop defending and start expressing. You stop fearing yourself and start trusting yourself. Jung promised this transformation to anyone willing to do the work, but he also warned, the shadow will not be ignored. At midlife, it will make itself known one way or another, consciously through deliberate integration, or unconsciously through symptom, projection, and crisis. The choice, he said, is yours, but the confrontation is inevitable. Michael's choice is coming. The shadow has been patient, but its patience is ending. Soon he'll have to decide, continue defending the false self and suffer the consequences, or surrender to the shadow's wisdom and discover who he actually is beneath all the pretending. The afternoon of his life depends on that choice, and the same is true for you. There was a morning when Sarah couldn't get out of bed, not because she was physically ill. The alarm went off at 5:30 a.m. like it had for 15 years. Her body was capable of movement. Her children needed to be fed, dressed, driven to school. Her job as a senior executive at a tech company required her presence at an 8 a.m. meeting. Her responsibilities were clear, her obligations undeniable. But when she tried to lift herself from the mattress, she felt as though she were weighted down with lead. Not fatigue. She'd powered through exhaustion countless times. This was something else, something more fundamental. It felt like gravity had intensified specifically for her, like the universe itself was pressing her into the bed, refusing to let her continue performing the role she'd been playing for decades. She was 44 years old, vice president of operations, 2 children, ages 12 and 9, marriage that looked perfect in photographs, 6-figure salary, respected by colleagues, admired by neighbors, the kind of woman other women saw as having it all: career success, beautiful family, maintained appearance, active social life. If you'd asked anyone who knew her to describe Sarah, they would have used words like capable, organized, accomplished, strong. But that morning, lying in bed, unable to move, Sarah felt none of those things. She felt like a hologram that had suddenly become aware of its own insubstantiality, like a movie character who'd suddenly realized she was being projected onto a screen, that she had no actual existence beyond the light and shadow of performance. Her husband knocked on the door. "Sarah, the kids need breakfast. Are you okay?" She opened her mouth to respond with her usual efficiency. "I'm fine, I'll be right there." But the words wouldn't come. Instead, she started crying. Not gentle tears, but body-shaking sobs that seemed to come from some deep place she didn't know existed. Her husband opened the door, alarmed, asking what was wrong. And Sarah realized with complete clarity she had no idea what was wrong, or rather everything was wrong, but in a way she couldn't explain because the wrongness wasn't about any specific problem. The wrongness was about existence itself. She called in sick to work. She told her husband to handle the kids. She stayed in bed for 3 days. And during those 3 days, lying in the dark, Sarah experienced what Carl Jung called the death of the ego, the psychological dissolution that marks the threshold between the first and second half of life. This is the phenomenon that modern psychology tries to categorize as depression, as burnout, as midlife crisis. And there are certainly overlapping symptoms: the fatigue, the loss of motivation, the existential emptiness. But Jung understood something that most contemporary practitioners miss. What Sarah was experiencing wasn't pathology, it was metamorphosis. And the difference is crucial, because if you treat metamorphosis as illness, You abort the transformation and doom the person to years of suffering. Let me explain what Jung discovered about ego death, because understanding this is essential for anyone at the midlife threshold. The ego in Jungian psychology is your sense of I, your conscious identity, the part of you that says, I am Sarah, I am an executive, I am a mother, I am successful. It's not the same as the Freudian ego. It's closer to what we commonly call the self, with a lowercase s, your everyday sense of who you are. For the first half of life, your primary developmental task is to build a strong ego. You need to develop a coherent identity, establish yourself in the world, create a stable sense of self that can navigate relationships, pursue goals, handle challenges. A weak ego in youth leads to problems, lack of direction, inability to commit, difficulty maintaining relationships or careers. So the psyche invests enormous energy in ego building during the first 45 years. But here's what Jung discovered that was revolutionary. The ego is not meant to be permanent. It's meant to be a stage, a necessary stage, but ultimately a provisional one. Because the ego, by its nature, is limited. It's constructed from conscious awareness, from the personality you developed, from the persona you present to the world. And all of that is partial, incomplete. It's a fragment of your total psyche mistaking itself for the whole. Underneath the ego is what Jung called the self, with a capital S, a much larger intelligence that encompasses your entire psyche, conscious and unconscious. The self is your total potential, your complete being, the pattern of wholeness that you're meant to become. And at midlife, the self begins to assert itself against the ego's dominance. This is the central crisis of the afternoon of life. The ego, which has been running your existence for decades, must surrender its supremacy to the self. And from the ego's perspective, this surrender feels like death, because it is death. The death of the limited identity you thought you were. The death of the partial self you've been operating from. The death of the constructed person you've been pretending to be. Sarah's 3 days in bed was her ego dying, not dramatically, not permanently, but definitely. The structure of identity she'd been maintaining was collapsing. The Sarah, who was an efficient executive, capable mother, accomplished professional, that constructed self was revealing itself as performance, as persona, as ultimately insubstantial. And when a structure you've believed to be solid reveals itself as hollow, the experience is vertigo, terror, and grief all at once. Jung went through this himself. In 1913, at age 38, he experienced what he later called my confrontation with the unconscious. For years, he descended into what looked like psychosis, visions, auditory hallucinations, encounters with archetypal figures that seemed utterly real. His colleagues thought he was having a breakdown. He feared he was going insane. But he had the courage to remain curious rather than defensive, to explore the experience rather than shut it down. What Jung discovered during this period, documented in his Red Book, which wasn't published until after his death, was that his ego was dissolving to make way for something larger. The rational, scientific Carl Jung was insufficient for the work he was meant to do. He had to die psychologically in order to be reborn as someone capable of receiving the insights that would become his life's work. This is why Jung later wrote, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely." Because accepting yourself completely means acknowledging that who you thought you were is not who you actually are. It means facing the fact that your ego identity is a construction, a provisional arrangement, a temporary shelter that was never meant to be your permanent home. For Sarah, this realization hit with devastating force. Who was she if she wasn't the accomplished executive? If she couldn't fulfill her responsibilities? If she couldn't maintain the performance that everyone, including herself, had come to expect. The questions produced an existential vertigo because they threatened the foundation of her entire identity. Let me describe the phenomenology of ego death so you can recognize it if you encounter it. It often begins with a sense of exhaustion that sleep doesn't remedy. Not physical tiredness, but a deep psychological fatigue, a weariness of maintaining the persona, of performing the role, of being who everyone expects you to be. You feel like you've been running a race for decades and suddenly realize you don't know where the finish line is, or even if there is one. Then comes the disidentification. You start experiencing yourself as separate from your roles, your achievements, your identity. You might look in the mirror and feel like you're looking at a stranger. You might hear yourself speaking and feel like someone else is using your voice. Your own life starts to feel like something you're observing rather than living. This dissociative quality is terrifying because it threatens the continuity of self that the ego depends on. Next, there's often a collapse of motivation. Things that used to energize you, career advancement, social validation, goal achievement, suddenly feel meaningless. Not in a depressive, nothing matters way, but in a more specific way. The currency of ego satisfaction has stopped working. Your psyche is no longer accepting payment in the form of external validation. The rewards that drove you for decades have lost their power. Alongside this comes a grief that seems disproportionate to any specific loss. Sarah wasn't grieving anything concrete. She hadn't lost her job, her marriage, her health, but she was grieving nonetheless. Grieving the death of who she thought she was. Grieving the life she'd been living. Grieving the future she'd imagined that now felt impossible. This grief is the ego mourning its own dissolution. And finally, there's often a dark night of the soul, a period of deep existential despair where nothing makes sense, where the old meanings have collapsed but new meanings haven't emerged. You're suspended in a psychological nowhere, feeling unmoored from your previous life, but not yet connected to whatever comes next. This is the void Jung talked about, the necessary emptiness that precedes rebirth. Now here's what's crucial to understand. This is not clinical depression, though it can look similar. Clinical depression is often characterized by a flattening of affect, by numbness, by the inability to feel. What Sarah was experiencing, what anyone going through ego death experiences, is the opposite. It's an overwhelming amount of feeling, a tsunami of emotion that's been dammed up for decades. It's not the absence of life force, but the return of it, flooding through cracks in the ego's defenses. The difference is crucial for treatment. If you medicate ego death as depression, you abort the process. You stabilize the ego just when it needs to destabilize. You reinforce the old structure just when it needs to collapse. This doesn't mean medication is never appropriate. Severe suffering requires intervention. But it means we need to distinguish between pathological depression and transformative dissolution. Jung offered a metaphor that's become famous, the caterpillar and the butterfly. But most people don't know the biological details that make this metaphor so apt. Inside the chrysalis, the caterpillar doesn't grow wings and transform gradually. It liquefies, it completely dissolves into an undifferentiated cellular soup. Only then, from that liquid chaos, does the butterfly form. The caterpillar must die completely for the butterfly to emerge. This is what happens at the midlife threshold. Your ego identity, the psychological caterpillar you've been for 45 years, must liquefy, must dissolve into uncertainty, meaninglessness, identity chaos. This feels catastrophic because from the caterpillar's perspective, it is catastrophic. Everything it knew itself to be is disappearing. But from the self's perspective, from the larger intelligence orchestrating this transformation, the dissolution is necessary. The old form cannot simply morph into the new form. It must be broken down to its elements and reconstituted. Sarah, lying in bed for 3 days, was in the liquefaction phase. Everything solid was becoming fluid. All the certainties she'd built her life on were revealing themselves as provisional. Every identity she'd clung to was loosening its grip. And she had no idea what would emerge from this dissolution. She only knew that she couldn't continue being who she'd been. Her husband was worried. He suggested therapy, medication, maybe a vacation. He was trying to fix her using the logic of the first half of life, the logic that says problems have solutions, that suffering should be eliminated, that the goal is to return to normal functioning as quickly as possible. But Sarah instinctively knew that this wasn't something to be fixed. This was something to be surrendered to. This is where Jung's concept of the self becomes essential, because what's dying isn't your total being, it's your limited conception of your being. The ego is dying, but something larger is being born. Sarah the executive, Sarah the mother, Sarah the accomplished professional. These are all real aspects of her, but they're not the totality of her. They're roles she's been performing, identities she's been inhabiting, and beneath those roles is something more fundamental, more authentic, more complete. Jung called this larger intelligence the self, and he described it as the organizing center of the total psyche, conscious and unconscious. The self is what you're becoming through the process of individuation. It's not something you create or achieve. It's something you already are but have forgotten or never known. And the ego's job in the second half of life is not to be the center anymore, but to become the servant of the self. This is a revolutionary shift in the locus of identity. For 45 years, Sarah has been identifying with her ego, with her conscious sense of herself, her achievements, her persona. Now she must learn to identify with something larger, with the self that includes her ego but also encompasses her shadow, her unlived potentials, her unconscious depths, her archetypal patterns. This is what Jung meant by individuation, becoming who you truly are by expanding your identity beyond the narrow confines of the ego. But the transition is brutal. It requires what mystics throughout history have called the dark night of the soul, a period of profound spiritual crisis where all familiar landmarks disappear, where God seems absent, where meaning evaporates. St. John of the Cross described it. The Buddha experienced it. Jesus went through it in the desert. Every authentic spiritual tradition recognizes this passage as essential to transformation. Jung secularized this understanding by showing that the dark night isn't just a mystical experience, it's a psychological one. It's what happens when the ego, which has been mistaking itself for the totality of your being, encounters the vastness of the unconscious and realizes its own insufficiency. The darkness isn't the absence of light, it's the overwhelming presence of light that the ego cannot yet perceive. Sarah, in her darkness, was actually approaching light, but she didn't know that yet. She only knew that everything familiar had become strange. Everything certain had become questionable. Everything solid had become liquid. She felt like she was disappearing, and in a sense, she was. The constructed Sarah was disappearing, but the essential Sarah, the one who had always existed beneath the performance, was finally getting the space to emerge. On the third day, something shifted. She got out of bed, not because she felt better, but because she felt different. The weight that had been pressing her down hadn't lifted, but she'd stopped fighting it. She'd surrendered to it. And in that surrender, she found a strange kind of peace. Not happiness, not relief, but a quiet acceptance that whatever was happening needed to happen. She looked in the mirror and saw a woman she barely recognized, not because her appearance had changed, but because she was seeing herself without the familiar lens of her persona. She wasn't seeing Sarah the executive or Sarah the mother. She was seeing Sarah, the human being beneath all the roles, the consciousness beneath all the identities, the self that had been waiting patiently for 44 years to be acknowledged. This is the gift on the other side of ego death. You discover that you're more than you thought you were, not less. The ego death feels like annihilation, but it's actually liberation. You're being freed from the prison of the limited self. Even though that prison felt like home, you're being invited into a larger life, even though the invitation arrives as crisis. Jung developed a framework for navigating this passage, and it's worth understanding in detail because ego death is not a single event. It's a process with stages. Stage 1, denial. You notice the symptoms, the exhaustion, the emptiness, the dissociation, but you try to explain them away. You're just stressed. You need a vacation. You're working too hard. This is normal. Stage 2, resistance. The symptoms intensify, but you fight them. You double down on the strategies that used to work. You try harder, achieve more, perform better. But nothing works because the problem isn't insufficient effort. It's insufficient being. Stage 3, collapse. This is what happened to Sarah. The resistance fails catastrophically. You can't maintain the performance anymore. The ego's defenses crumble. You're forced into the void whether you're ready or not. This is the liquefaction phase, and it's unavoidable if transformation is to occur. Stage 4, surrender. At some point, it might take days, months, or years. You stop fighting. You accept that the old self is dying and that you can't prevent it. This surrender is not defeat. It's wisdom. It's the ego finally acknowledging that it's not in control, that there's a larger intelligence at work. Stage 5, exploration. Once you've surrendered, you begin to explore the void. Who are you without your roles? What do you actually want versus what you thought you should want? What parts of yourself have been buried? This is where shadow work, active imagination, and deep self-inquiry happen. Stage 6, integration. Slowly, a new identity emerges. Not a return to the old self, but a reconstitution at a higher level of complexity. You're still you, but you're more complete, more authentic, more aligned with the self. Stage 7, rebirth. You re-enter the world, but from a different center. You're no longer living from ego, but from self. Your actions are still competent, but they're not driven by the need for validation. Your relationships are still important, but they're not defined by persona maintenance. You're living from essence rather than performance. Sarah is somewhere between surrender and exploration. She doesn't know what's coming, but she's stopped resisting it. And that shift from resistance to curiosity changes everything. Because once you stop defending against the death of your ego, you create space for the birth of yourself. This is what makes midlife ego death so different from the identity crises of youth. When you're 25 and questioning who you are, you're still in the process of building your ego. The confusion is about which ego to build, which career path, which relationship style, which values to adopt. But at 45, the crisis is more fundamental. You're not questioning which identity to inhabit. You're questioning the entire mechanism of identity itself. And this questioning can't be resolved by making different choices within the same framework. You can't solve an ego death crisis by changing jobs or relationships or locations, because the crisis isn't about external circumstances, it's about consciousness itself. It's about the shift from identifying with a partial self to identifying with the total self. Jung was explicit about the timing of this shift. He said you cannot successfully navigate the second half of life using the psychological operating system of the first half. The values, goals, and strategies that worked brilliantly in youth become obstacles in maturity. In youth, you need ambition. It drives achievement. In maturity, ambition without wisdom becomes compulsion. In youth, You need external validation. It confirms your progress. In maturity, external validation becomes a distraction from internal alignment. This is why the ego must die. Not because it's bad or wrong, but because it's insufficient for the task ahead. The ego got you to 45. It built your career, your relationships, your life structure, but it cannot get you through the second half of life, because the second half requires different capacities: introspection rather than achievement, depth rather than breadth, being rather than doing, wisdom rather than knowledge. Sarah is discovering this through direct experience. The executive skills that made her successful, strategic thinking, efficiency, goal orientation, are useless for navigating ego death. In fact, they're counterproductive. Ego death can't be managed or optimized. It can only be surrendered to, and surrender is not a skill the achieving self has cultivated. Let me share what Sarah does next, because her choices illustrate the pathway through ego death that Jung mapped. After those 3 days in bed, she doesn't immediately return to normal. She can't. The old normal has been revealed as unsustainable. So she makes a radical choice. She takes a leave of absence from work. Not to travel or rest, but to simply be with the dissolution that's happening. Her husband is confused. Her colleagues are concerned. Her parents are worried. Everyone wants her to get back to herself. But Sarah knows with a certainty that surprises her that getting back to herself is exactly what she can't do. That self is dead or dying, and trying to resurrect it would abort the transformation that's trying to happen. Instead, she starts doing things she's never done. She sits in silence for an hour each morning, just being present to whatever arises: the anxiety, the grief, the emptiness, the strange peace. She's not meditating in any formal sense. She's just allowing herself to exist without agenda, without performance, without the constant doing that has defined her life. She starts writing. Not goal-oriented journaling, but stream of consciousness exploration. She writes to herself, asking questions she's never asked. Who am I when I'm not being productive? What do I actually want? What have I been afraid to feel? What parts of myself did I sacrifice to become successful? The writing feels awkward at first, self-indulgent, pointless, but gradually it becomes a conversation between her ego and something deeper: herself, her unconscious, her soul, whatever name feels right. She notices that she's been dreaming more vividly. For years, she rarely remembered dreams, and when she did, they were mundane, work scenarios, logistical problems. But now her dreams are strange, symbolic, powerful. She dreams of houses with hidden rooms. She dreams of swimming in deep water. She dreams of giving birth to animals. She doesn't understand what these dreams mean, but she writes them down, sensing their communications from the part of her psyche that's trying to guide the transformation. This is active imagination, though Sarah doesn't know Jung's term for it. She's creating a dialogue between her conscious mind and her unconscious. She's giving the self a way to speak to her, to show her what she needs to see, to guide her through the dissolution and toward the reconstruction. And slowly, over weeks, then months, something begins to shift. The paralyzing emptiness starts to feel less like death and more like spaciousness. The loss of her old identity starts to feel less like tragedy and more like liberation. She realizes that for 44 years, she's been living according to a script she never consciously chose. A script written by her parents' expectations, her culture's values, her own internalized shoulds. She became an executive because it was prestigious, because it proved her worth, because it demonstrated that a woman could succeed in a male-dominated field. But she never asked herself if she actually wanted to be an executive. She just assumed that wanting success meant wanting that particular form of success. Now, in the void of ego death, she has the space to ask, What do I actually want my life to be about? The answer doesn't come immediately, and when it starts to come, it's not what she expected. She realizes that what she loved most in her career wasn't the strategy or the management or the power. It was the moments when she could help develop her team members, when she could mentor younger women, when she could create systems that made people's work more meaningful rather than just more efficient. The executive role gave her occasional access to this work, but it wasn't the center of her job. It was peripheral. So a question forms. What if I built a life where that peripheral thing became central? What if I stopped pursuing success as the world defines it and started pursuing meaning as I define it? This is the reconstitution beginning. This is the butterfly starting to form from the liquid chaos of the dissolved caterpillar. Sarah doesn't immediately know what concrete form this new life will take, but she knows with increasing clarity the essence of what she's moving toward. She's moving from performing to being, from proving to expressing, from achieving to serving. And here's what makes this so different from a regular career change or midlife pivot. It's not about finding a better role within the same value system. It's about changing the value system itself. Sarah isn't just switching from corporate executive to nonprofit leader or therapist or teacher, though any of those might be eventual expressions. She's switching from ego orientation to self-orientation, from external validation to internal alignment, from life as performance to life as authenticity. This is what Jung meant when he talked about the religious function of the psyche. Not religion in the institutional sense, but religion in the etymological sense. Religare, to reconnect, to bind back together. Ego death is the psyche's way of forcing reconnection with your essence, with your totality, with what Jung called the God within. When the ego dies, the self can finally be heard, and the self has been waiting patiently for 45 years to guide your life. But let's be clear about the danger here, because Jung was adamant about this. Ego death without ethical grounding leads to disaster. Some people go through ego dissolution and emerge as narcissists who identify with the self rather than having a relationship with it. They confuse the death of the limited ego with the arrival of unlimited ego. They think, I've transcended the normal rules, I'm enlightened, I'm special. This is inflation, and it's catastrophic. True ego death leads to humility, not grandiosity, because what you discover is not that you're more than everyone else, but that you're the same as everyone else. Just another human being struggling with consciousness, just another psyche navigating the archetypal patterns, just another soul trying to become whole. The death of the ego reveals your commonality, your interconnection, your fundamental ordinariness, and that ordinariness, paradoxically, is what makes you extraordinary, because it's true. Sarah is experiencing this humility. In her dissolution, she's discovering that she's not special. The high-powered executive identity was a defense against ordinariness, a way of proving that she was more than just another woman, just another human, just another consciousness. But in losing that identity, she's found something more precious, her humanity. She's just Sarah, no longer needing to be Sarah plus achievements, Sarah plus status, Sarah plus validation. And in that just Sarah-ness, she's finding an unexpected freedom. She can breathe, she can rest, she can exist without performing. The constant vigilance required to maintain her persona, the monitoring of how she's perceived, the management of her image, the curation of her success, all of that exhausting effort can finally cease, because she's no longer defending an identity, she's simply being. This is what the ego death offers, the possibility of existing without the burden of constant self-creation and self-defense. Jung called it the natural state, a way of being that flows from essence rather than effort, from self rather than ego. It's not that you stop functioning in the world. It's that your functioning becomes an expression of who you are rather than a compensation for who you're not. Sarah will eventually return to work, but not to the same work and not from the same motivation. She'll discover that her legal background and executive experience can be used in service of something larger than corporate profit. She'll create a nonprofit focused on women's leadership development, using everything she learned in her corporate career, but redirecting it toward meaning rather than money. She'll take a significant pay cut. Her life will become simpler, less prestigious, less impressive on paper, but she'll be alive in a way she hasn't been since childhood, because she'll be living from herself rather than her persona, from her essence rather than her performance, from her truth rather than her shoulds. And that aliveness, that sense of finally inhabiting your own life, is worth any amount of external success. This is the promise on the other side of ego death. Not that you'll be happier in the conventional sense, you might not be. Not that life will be easier, it probably won't be, but that you'll be real, you'll be authentic, you'll be yourself. And that selfhood, once tasted, makes all the years of performance feel like a kind of death you were living through without knowing it. Jung's final word on ego death is this: there is no birth of consciousness without pain. The ego must die for the self to live. The caterpillar must liquefy for the butterfly to emerge. The false self must be destroyed for the true self to be born. And this process is not optional for anyone who wants to live the second half of life, with consciousness, with authenticity, with meaning. The question is not whether you'll go through ego death if you cross the midlife threshold. The question is whether you'll go through it consciously or unconsciously. Consciously means you recognize what's happening, you cooperate with the process, you allow the death to occur without frantically trying to resuscitate the dying self. Unconsciously means you experience it as crisis, as depression, as breakdown, desperately clinging to the old identity while the psyche forcibly removes it. Sarah chose consciousness. Not perfectly, she didn't understand what was happening at first. She resisted, she was terrified. But when the resistance failed, she had the courage to surrender rather than to fight to the death. And that surrender made all the difference, because surrender is not defeat. Surrender is wisdom. Surrender is the ego finally acknowledging that it's not God, that there's a larger intelligence at work, that the death it's experiencing is in service of a life it cannot yet imagine. If you're at this threshold, if you're feeling the ground opening beneath your carefully constructed identity, if you're experiencing the vertigo of ego death, know this: you're not dying, you're being born. The person you thought you were is dying, so the person you actually are can live. And yes, it's terrifying. Yes, it's painful. Yes, it feels like annihilation. But on the other side of this death is a life that's finally, authentically yours. Comment below if you've ever felt like you were disappearing, like the person you'd been for decades was dissolving. Because if you have, you're not alone. You're not crazy. You're not failing. You're experiencing what every conscious person must eventually experience: the death of the false self and the birth of the true self. And that birth, though it arrives as crisis, is the most sacred passage of the human life. The afternoon of your life is calling, but it cannot begin until the morning of your life has ended. And that ending, that ego death, is the threshold you must cross. Sarah crossed it. Michael is approaching it. And you, if you're 45 or beyond and feeling the dissolution beginning, you're standing at the edge of it right now. The question is simple: will you jump or will you be pushed? Jung would tell you, either way, you're going over, but jumping is so much more graceful. Michael sat in his car outside the therapist's office for 20 minutes before his first appointment, trying to decide if he was actually going to go in. 47 years old, and he'd never been to therapy, never needed it. Therapy was for people who couldn't handle their problems, people who were weak, people who needed someone else to tell them how to live. He'd always figured things out himself, powered through challenges, remained strong when others crumbled. But here he was, parked outside a therapist's office, because his wife had given him an ultimatum: get help or I'm leaving. And beneath her ultimatum was a truth he couldn't ignore. He was destroying his marriage, alienating his children, and raging at everyone around him with an intensity that frightened even himself. So despite every instinct that told him therapy was admission of failure, he walked through that door. The therapist was a woman in her 50s, and the first thing she said after he explained his situation caught him completely off guard. "Michael, do you ever let yourself cry?" The question felt absurd. Of course he didn't cry. He hadn't cried since he was maybe 12 years old, when his father told him that men don't cry, that tears are weakness, that the world breaks people who show emotion. He'd internalized that lesson so thoroughly that crying felt not just uncomfortable, but literally impossible, like asking if he ever let himself fly. "No," he said. "I don't cry." "Why not?" she asked. "Because I'm not—" He stopped, unsure how to finish the sentence. "Because I'm not weak, because I'm not a child, because I'm not a woman." All of those answers felt true, but also, somehow, inadequate. "Because you're not allowed to," she finished for him. "Because at some point, probably when you were very young, you learned that expressing emotion, particularly sadness, vulnerability, fear, was dangerous. So you developed a strategy: bury the emotion, convert it to anger when necessary, maintain the appearance of strength at all costs." Does that sound accurate? Michael felt something shift in his chest, a tightness he'd been carrying for so long he'd stopped noticing it. "Yes," he said quietly, "that's exactly it." What Michael didn't know, what the therapist was beginning to help him see, was that he was experiencing what Carl Jung called the anima problem, and it's one of the most misunderstood and most crucial aspects of midlife transformation. Let me explain Jung's theory of anima and animus, because it's both brilliant and frequently misconstrued. Jung observed that every human psyche contains both masculine and feminine psychological qualities, not in a simplistic gender binary way, but as fundamental modes of consciousness. The masculine principle, which Jung associated with logos, emphasizes differentiation, rationality, goal orientation, assertion, analysis, independence. The feminine principle, which Jung associated with eros, emphasizes connection, receptivity, emotional depth, intuition, synthesis, interdependence. Now, here's the crucial point. Everyone, regardless of biological sex or gender identity, has access to both principles. But in the first half of life, most people develop one principle while suppressing the other, usually in response to cultural conditioning and family dynamics. Men in traditional masculine cultures are encouraged to develop their masculine side while repressing their feminine side. Women in traditional feminine cultures are encouraged to develop their feminine side while repressing their masculine side. Jung called the repressed contrasexual aspect the anima in men and the animus in women. And he discovered something remarkable. At midlife, the psyche demands integration of the contrasexual aspect. The qualities you've been suppressing for 45 years suddenly demand attention. Men must integrate their anima, their capacity for emotion, receptivity, relationship, intuition. Women must integrate their animus, their capacity for assertion, independence, rational analysis, ambition. This is not about becoming less masculine or less feminine. It's about becoming whole. It's about reclaiming the psychological capacities you exiled in youth because they didn't fit the gender role you were assigned or adopted. And for most people, This integration is one of the most challenging and most liberating aspects of the midlife passage. Michael's rage, his therapist explained, was not actually rage. It was a cover emotion, a socially acceptable way for a man to express feelings that weren't acceptable in their raw form. Beneath his anger was grief. Beneath his irritation was fear. Beneath his aggression was vulnerability. But he'd learned decades ago that men don't express those things, so his psyche converted them to the one emotion that was permissible: anger. "You've been performing masculinity," she told him, "for so long that you've forgotten you're performing it. You've convinced yourself that being strong, rational, and invulnerable is who you are. But it's not who you are. It's who you learned to be in order to survive in a world that punishes men for showing weakness." This hit Michael like a physical blow, because she was right. His entire identity, the tough lawyer, the strong provider, the man who could handle anything, was a performance. And that performance required constantly suppressing half of his psychological reality: his need for emotional connection, his desire to be vulnerable, his capacity for tenderness and receptivity. He'd sacrificed his anima for the sake of social acceptance and professional success. And now, at 47, his psyche was demanding payment. The anima, locked away for decades, was erupting through the only channel available: rage, depression, existential crisis. His psyche was trying to tell him, "You cannot live the second half of your life with half of yourself still in exile." Let's look at Sarah's parallel journey, because the anima-animus integration looks different for women, but follows the same essential pattern. Sarah, remember, had built her career on being nurturing, collaborative, supportive. She was the executive who cared about people, who prioritized relationships, who managed through emotional intelligence rather than fear. These are valuable qualities, but Sarah had developed them at the expense of her animus, her capacity for aggressive ambition, for saying no without guilt, for prioritizing her own needs. In her leave of absence, working with her own therapist, Sarah made a shocking discovery. She was furious. Beneath her carefully cultivated warmth and accommodation was decades of suppressed anger. Anger at being expected to always nurture others. Anger at being praised for being collaborative when men were praised for being decisive. Anger at having absorbed her mother's programming that a woman's value comes from how well she serves others. One afternoon, alone in her house, Sarah allowed herself to feel this anger fully for the first time. She screamed. She threw pillows. She broke a plate, intentionally, not in rage loss of control, but in deliberate expression of fury. And afterward, she felt something she'd never felt: powerful. Not powerful in the sense of having power over others, but powerful in the sense of having access to her own aggressive energy, her own capacity to assert herself, her own animus. "I've spent 44 years being nice," she told her therapist, "and I'm done. I don't want to be nice anymore. I want to be real, and real includes angry, real includes selfish, real includes saying no, real includes putting my own needs first sometimes." Her therapist nodded. "You're integrating your animus, the masculine energy you've been suppressing, because good women don't act that way. But here's what's important. Integrating your animus doesn't mean abandoning your relational capacity. It means adding assertion to your compassion, adding boundaries to your nurturing, adding self-advocacy to your other orientation. You're not becoming a man. You're becoming a complete woman." This is the crucial distinction Jung made. Anima-animus integration is not about gender transition or adopting stereotypical traits of the opposite sex. It's about psychological completion, becoming a full human being rather than a gendered fragment. Men integrating their anima don't become less masculine, they become more fully human. Women integrating their animus don't become less feminine, they become more fully human. And midlife is when this integration becomes urgent because the psyche knows. You have limited time left. You cannot afford to live the second half of your life with half of yourself still in exile. The unconscious will force the issue, one way or another. Let me describe the specific ways anima-animus integration manifests at midlife, because recognizing these patterns is essential. For men integrating anima, the hard-charging executive suddenly becomes interested in poetry, art, spirituality. The stoic father starts crying at commercials. The rational scientist develops fascination with dreams, synchronicity, the irrational. The independent loner starts craving deep emotional connection. The aggressive competitor becomes gentle with his children. The emotionally distant husband wants to talk about feelings. These aren't random changes. They're the anima, the exiled feminine, finally getting oxygen. Men often resist this integration fiercely because they've been taught their entire lives that these qualities are weakness. But Jung was clear. The anima contains a man's soul, his capacity for depth, his access to the unconscious, his bridge to the self. Without anima integration, a man remains psychologically shallow, no matter how successful he is externally. For women integrating animus, the accommodating wife suddenly sets firm boundaries. The people-pleasing professional starts saying no without guilt. The emotionally oriented mother becomes interested in abstract ideas, philosophy, strategy. The collaborative leader becomes comfortably decisive. The woman who always put others first starts prioritizing her own ambitions. The nurturing caregiver discovers her capacity for healthy aggression. Again, this isn't about becoming masculine in a stereotypical sense. It's about reclaiming psychological territory that was abandoned for the sake of social acceptance. Women are often shamed for animus integration, called selfish, cold, unfeminine, bitchy, precisely because it threatens the cultural expectation that women should be endlessly nurturing and self-sacrificing. But Jung was adamant. The animus contains a woman's spirit, her capacity for agency, her access to her own authority, her bridge to autonomy. Without animus integration, a woman remains psychologically imprisoned, no matter how loved she is by others. Now, here's where this gets particularly interesting. Midlife anima-animus integration often coincides with hormonal changes, and Jung believed this wasn't coincidental. As men's testosterone declines and estrogen becomes relatively more prominent, they naturally become more emotionally available, more interested in relationships, more receptive. As women's estrogen declines and testosterone becomes relatively more prominent in relative terms, they naturally become more assertive, more autonomous, more comfortable with conflict. The biology supports the psychology, or perhaps more accurately, the biology is the psychology, because Jung understood that psyche and soma are not separate but two aspects of the same unified system. Your body at midlife is trying to help you become whole by shifting the hormonal balance that maintained your one-sided gender performance in youth. But here's the danger Jung warned about. Anima-animus integration must be conscious or it leads to disaster. When men unconsciously integrate their anima, it often emerges through projection. They fall in love with a woman who embodies the feminine qualities they've repressed, then become obsessively dependent on her to provide access to their own soul. This is the classic midlife affair, the powerful man leaving his age-appropriate wife for a younger woman who makes him feel alive again. What he's actually feeling is his own anima projected onto another person. Similarly, when women unconsciously integrate their animus, it often emerges through possession. They become identified with masculine energy in a rigid, defensive way, acting out aggression and dominance rather than truly owning their authority. This is the woman who becomes a tyrant at work, who bullies subordinates, who mistakes cruelty for strength. She's not integrating her animus, she's being possessed by it. Conscious integration is different. Michael, working with his therapist, begins to allow himself to feel his grief, his fear, his vulnerability, not by projecting them onto his wife and demanding she manage them, but by developing his own capacity to hold these emotions. He starts journaling. He allows himself to cry, first in therapy, then at home, then eventually without shame. He discovers that expressing emotion doesn't make him weak, it makes him human. And paradoxically, accessing his vulnerability makes him a better lawyer, more empathetic with clients, more persuasive with juries, more effective as a leader because he's no longer defending against his own humanity. Sarah, meanwhile, begins to claim her anger, her ambition, her capacity to prioritize herself, not by becoming cold or rejecting relationships, but by adding boundaries to her compassion. She tells her husband she needs regular solitude for her psychological work. She tells her children they're old enough to handle more responsibilities themselves. She starts a nonprofit but structures it, so she's the decisive leader rather than the collaborative facilitator. She discovers that assertion doesn't make her unlikable, it makes her authentic, and paradoxically, her relationships improve because she's no longer silently resenting everyone for the self-sacrifice she was never asked to make. This is the gift of conscious anima-animus integration. You become more of yourself by reclaiming what you thought you had to discard. You become more capable, more complete, more fully alive. Men discover that accessing their feminine doesn't castrate them, it deepens them. Women discover that accessing their masculine doesn't masculinize them, it empowers them. But let's be brutally honest about the cost, because Jung never sugarcoated this. Anima-animus integration will threaten your relationships. Michael's wife is confused by his new emotionality. She married the strong, stoic man, and now he's crying and wanting to process feelings. Part of her is relieved that he's finally opening up, but part of her is destabilized because the familiar dynamic has shifted. Sarah's husband is threatened by her new boundaries. He relied on her endless accommodation, and now she's saying no, prioritizing her work, expecting him to contribute equally to household management. Some relationships survive this transition. The partners grow together, each doing their own midlife work, each supporting the other's integration. But many relationships don't survive because they were built on complementary one-sidedness rather than wholeness. The stoic man married the emotional woman so she could carry his anima for him. The nurturing woman married the decisive man so he could carry her animus for her. When each partner reclaims their own contrasexual energy, the complementary arrangement collapses. This is why Jung said midlife is so dangerous for marriages. It's not about boredom or 7-year itches or mid-crisis affairs, though those can be symptoms. It's about fundamental shifts in psychological structure that change who each partner is. And if both partners aren't doing this work consciously, if they're not growing in parallel, the relationship often cannot accommodate the transformation. Michael and his wife are in couples therapy now, trying to navigate this together. It's difficult. She's having to release her role as the sole carrier of emotional labor in the relationship. He's having to accept that strength includes vulnerability. They're both learning that the marriage they had is ending, not because they're divorcing, but because they're evolving into different people who must consciously choose to stay together, rather than remaining together out of habit or complementary need. Sarah's marriage did end, though not with bitterness. Her husband couldn't grow with her. He wanted the old Sarah back, the accommodating, nurturing, endlessly available wife and mother, but that Sarah was dead, and Sarah didn't want to resurrect her. So they separated, not as enemies, but as people who'd outgrown their initial contract. It was grief, but it was also liberation. Here's what Jung understood that modern psychology often misses. The anima-animus integration at midlife isn't about becoming balanced in some bland androgynous way. It's about becoming dynamically whole, having access to both masculine and feminine energies, and being able to move fluidly between them as circumstances require. The integrated man can be assertive when assertion is needed, and receptive when receptivity is needed. The integrated woman can be nurturing when nurturing is needed, and aggressive when aggression is needed. This is psychological flexibility, psychological maturity, psychological wholeness. And it's only possible after midlife, because only after midlife does the psyche have enough structure to risk this kind of fundamental reorganization. Michael now runs a mediation practice instead of doing corporate litigation. He uses his legal expertise, his analytical skills, his masculine capacity for structure, but he's added his newly integrated anima, his empathy, his emotional intelligence, his capacity to hold space for others' vulnerability. He's more successful than he ever was as a corporate lawyer, not in terms of money, but in terms of meaning, satisfaction, and impact. Sarah's nonprofit is thriving. She's channeling her feminine capacity for relationship and her newly integrated masculine capacity for decisive leadership. She's become the kind of leader she wished she'd had, powerful but not domineering, ambitious but not exploitative, successful but not soul-destroying. She's living from wholeness rather than performance. This is what anima-animus integration looks like when it's done consciously, not a repudiation of your primary gender expression, but an expansion of it, an inclusion of what was excluded, a reclamation of what was abandoned. You don't become less of who you are. You become more of who you are, complete, whole, fully human. Comment below, if you're a man, have you noticed yourself becoming more emotional, more interested in relationships, more receptive? If you're a woman, have you noticed yourself becoming more assertive, more comfortable with conflict, more autonomous? Because these aren't signs of hormonal decline or personality disorder. They're signs of psychological maturation, the psyche's attempt to make you whole before it's too late. The afternoon of your life requires the qualities you exiled in the morning. Michael needed his anima, his capacity for feeling, to navigate his transformation. Sarah needed her animus, her capacity for assertion, to claim her authentic life. And you, regardless of your gender, need your contrasexual energy to complete the individuation process that midlife initiates. Jung's final word on this. The meeting with oneself is, at first, the meeting with one's own shadow, but the encounter with the shadow is only the beginning. Later, one comes to terms with the anima, animus, and in doing so, arrives at one's own wholeness. The shadow integration we explored earlier was just the first stage. Now comes the second, integrating the gender psychology you've been denying. And this integration isn't optional. The psyche will force it, consciously or unconsciously, gently or catastrophically. Michael and Sarah are doing it consciously. They're paying the price: disrupted relationships, identity confusion, social judgment. But they're also receiving the reward: wholeness, authenticity, completion. The question for you is the same question it's been throughout this journey. Will you do this consciously, or will the unconscious do it to you? Your anima or animus is waiting, and at midlife, it's done waiting patiently. There's a quote from Carl Jung that most people can't bear to hear. It sits in the back of your mind like a splinter you can't remove, festering quietly until one day, usually around 45, it erupts into consciousness with such force that it threatens to destroy everything you thought you knew about yourself. Jung said, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely. Not the most difficult thing, not the most challenging thing, the most terrifying thing." Why terrifying? Because acceptance means confronting something far more painful than your failures. It means confronting what you never even tried, the dreams you abandoned, the talents you buried, the relationships you sacrificed, the authentic self you traded for approval. Jung had a name for this. He called it the unlived life, and he believed, with a conviction that bordered on obsession, that the unlived life was the primary source of neurosis, bitterness, and that peculiar modern affliction we now call toxic positivity. That forced smile hiding a scream, that insistence that everything happens for a reason, when what you really mean is, I can't admit that I chose wrong, that I wasted years, that I betrayed myself. At 45, whether you're ready or not, the psyche demands an inventory, a brutal, unsparing accounting of everything you promised yourself you would do, everything you once believed you would become, and the vast gap between that vision and the life you're actually living. This isn't about midlife crisis. This isn't about buying a sports car or having an affair. Those are just desperate attempts to avoid the real confrontation. This is about something much deeper, much more existential. This is about the person you were supposed to be, meeting the person you became, and realizing they're strangers. Let me tell you what happens in that meeting. First, there's the regret, but not the kind of regret you're used to. Not regret over mistakes you made. We all make mistakes, and most of us have learned to forgive ourselves for them. No, this is the regret of omission, the regret of lives not lived, selves not expressed, risks not taken. It's the writer who spent 30 years in accounting and never wrote the novel. It's the musician who chose law school because it was practical and hasn't touched a piano in 2 decades. It's the woman who wanted to travel the world but married young, had children, and convinced herself that stability was the same as fulfillment. It's the man who buried his sensitivity, his creativity, his softness, because the world demanded he be strong, and who now doesn't recognize the hardened stranger staring back from the mirror. Jung understood this better than almost anyone because he lived it himself. In his late 30s and early 40s, at the height of his professional success, Jung experienced a psychological crisis so severe that he feared he was going insane. He had achieved everything society told him mattered: prestige, wealth, influence, family, and yet he felt hollow, dead inside. In his autobiography, Memories, Dreams, Reflections, Jung described asking himself a devastating question: what is the myth you are living? And the answer terrified him. He didn't have one. He'd been living everyone else's myth: Freud's myth, society's myth, the medical establishment's myth, but not his own. What followed was what Jung called his confrontation with the unconscious, a period of intense inner work, recorded in what would later become the Red Book, a document so personal, so raw, that Jung kept it hidden for decades. In it, he documented his conversations with inner figures, his visions, his descent into the depths of his own psyche to retrieve the parts of himself he'd abandoned. He emerged transformed, but he also emerged with a warning for the rest of us. If you don't confront your unlived life, it will haunt you. It will poison your relationships, corrupt your achievements, and turn the second half of your life into a slow death. So let me ask you something, and I want you to be honest, not with me, but with yourself. What did you dream of becoming when you were young? Before the world told you to be realistic, before you learned to manage expectations, before you traded passion for security. Close your eyes if you need to. Go back to that moment when you still believed anything was possible. What did you want? Who did you want to be? Got it? Good. Now answer this. What percentage of that dream are you living right now? 10%? 5? 0? If that question makes you uncomfortable, good. It should. Because that discomfort, that squirming, that urge to close this video and distract yourself with something, anything else, that's the unlived life, making itself known. And here's what most people don't understand. The unlived life doesn't just fade away. It doesn't politely retreat into the background of your consciousness and leave you alone. No, it intensifies as you age. It grows more demanding, more insistent, more desperate. Why? Because the psyche knows something you're trying to deny. Time is running out. Jung believed that midlife, that threshold around 45, represents the last real opportunity for psychological course correction. After 60, he observed, the window begins to narrow, not because it's impossible to change, but because psychological flexibility decreases. The persona hardens, the defenses calcify. The unlived life becomes a monument to what could have been, rather than a blueprint for what still might be. This is why midlife crises often look so dramatic, so seemingly irrational. The 47-year-old who quits his job to become a yoga instructor. The 50-year-old woman who leaves her marriage to find herself. The successful executive who has a breakdown and can't get out of bed. Society mocks these people, calls them selfish, immature, irresponsible. But Jung would say, these are the people who are listening to the psyche's emergency broadcast, the soul's last-ditch effort to be heard before it's too late. Now, does that mean every midlife crisis is healthy? Does it mean you should blow up your life, abandon your responsibilities, and chase some nostalgic fantasy of your younger self? No, absolutely not. And this is where Jung's wisdom becomes crucial. Jung made a critical distinction, one that most people miss. He distinguished between nostalgic fantasy and essence retrieval. Nostalgic fantasy is when you idealize the past, when you think, if only I could go back to being 25, everything would be better. That's regression. That's trying to relive something that's already gone, and it's doomed to fail because you're not 25 anymore. You can't unlearn what you know. You can't unknow what you've experienced. But essence retrieval, that's different. That's identifying the core longing beneath the abandoned dream and finding age-appropriate ways to fulfill it. Let me give you an example from my own practice, a composite drawn from several clients I've worked with over the years. I'll call her Sarah, though that's not her real name. Sarah came to me at 44. She was a corporate vice president, successful by any external measure. 6-figure salary, corner office, respect from her peers. But she was dying inside, not metaphorically, literally. She'd developed an autoimmune condition that her doctors couldn't fully explain, chronic fatigue, brain fog, a sense of disconnection so profound that she described feeling like she was watching her life through a window. In our first session, I asked her the question I ask all my midlife clients. If you could do anything, be anything, with no concern for money or practicality or what, people would think, what would you do? She started crying immediately, which told me everything I needed to know. The unlived life was right there, just beneath the surface. When she could speak, she said, I wanted to be an artist, a painter. I was good at it, really good. But my parents said art wasn't a real career, so I got an MBA instead. And now it's been 20 years since I've even picked up a brush. Nostalgic fantasy would have been, I need to quit my job, move to Paris, and paint full-time. But that wasn't realistic. Sarah had a family, a mortgage, responsibilities, so we worked on essence retrieval instead. What was the essence of what she'd lost? Not the literal act of painting, though that was important, but what painting represented: creativity, self-expression, the feeling of being in flow, of creating something beautiful, of connecting to a part of herself that the corporate world had exiled. Could she reclaim that? Yes, but not by abandoning her life, by integrating it into her life. Sarah started painting again, not full-time, just 30 minutes every morning before work. She converted a corner of her garage into a tiny studio. She didn't quit her job, not immediately, But she stopped identifying with it so completely. She stopped letting it define her. And something remarkable happened. Her autoimmune symptoms began to improve. Not overnight, not magically, but gradually, undeniably. As she gave the unlived life space to breathe, her body began to heal. 2 years later, Sarah did eventually transition out of corporate work, but not impulsively, not destructively. She saved money, she planned, and when she finally made the change, launching a women's leadership nonprofit that allowed her to integrate her business skills with her creative vision, it wasn't a crisis. It was a conscious choice. That's the difference. That's what Jung meant by ethical individuation. But here's where it gets uncomfortable. Here's the part most people don't want to hear. The unlived life doesn't just affect you. It radiates outward. It poisons your relationships. It corrupts your parenting. It infects your entire environment. Jung observed a particularly insidious pattern, parents projecting their unlived lives onto their children. The father who never made it as an athlete, pushing his son into sports the kid hates. The mother who abandoned her education to raise children, insisting her daughter go to medical school. The parent who repressed their creativity, demanding their child choose a practical career. This is psychological violence disguised as love. It's the parent saying, "I couldn't live my dream, so you have to live it for me." Or worse, "I sacrificed my dreams for you, so now you owe me." No child should bear that burden, but millions do, and then, and this is the cruelest irony, those children grow up and repeat the pattern. They abandon their own dreams. They develop their own unlived lives, and 30 years later, they project them onto their children. The cycle continues, generation after generation, an inheritance of unlived potential passed down like cursed heirlooms. Jung called this unconscious contagion. The unlived life is a virus that spreads through families, through communities, through entire cultures, and the only cure is consciousness, individual consciousness, the willingness to stop, to look in the mirror and to ask, what part of me have I exiled? What dream did I betray? And what am I going to do about it before it's too late? So let's do that right now. Let's do what Jung called the unlived life inventory. I'm going to guide you through 4 categories. For each one, I want you to identify at least one thing, maybe more, that you abandoned, buried, or sacrificed. Don't censor yourself. Don't judge yourself. Just be honest. First category, dreams. What did you dream of doing with your life that you never did? What career did you not pursue? What calling did you not answer? What vision of yourself did you let die? Write it down if you can, or just hold it in your mind. But name it. Give it form. Second category, talents. What were you naturally good at that you stopped developing? What skill or ability did you have as a child or young adult that you abandoned because it wasn't practical or didn't fit your persona? Maybe you were a dancer. Maybe you were a writer. Maybe you had a gift for connecting with people, for making them feel seen and valued, and somewhere along the way, you hardened yourself and lost that gift. Name it. Third category, relationships. What relationship did you sacrifice? What friendship did you let fade because you were too busy climbing the ladder? What romantic connection did you walk away from because it didn't fit your life plan? What family connection did you sever because it was too painful or too complicated? Not all of these can be recovered. Some are gone, but they still count. They're still part of your unlived life. Name them. Fourth category, self-expression. How did you silence yourself? What part of your authentic self did you learn to hide? What opinions did you stop voicing? What emotions did you stop feeling? What version of yourself did you exile because the world, or your family, or your career, or your relationship couldn't handle it? Name it. Name what you lost. If you're feeling emotional right now, if there's grief or anger or something you can't quite name, that's good. That's the unlived life making itself known, and the first step toward reclaiming it is feeling it. Because here's what Jung discovered. You cannot retrieve the past, but you can still live the essence of what was abandoned. That's the formula. That's the pathway through. You're not going to go back and relive your 20s. You're not going to undo your choices, but you can extract the essence, the core longing, the fundamental need, and fulfill it in ways that honor both who you were and who you've become. Jung called this essence extraction, and it has 4 stages. Stage 1, identify. What is the core longing beneath the abandoned dream? If you wanted to be a musician, is the essence about music specifically, or is it about creativity, self-expression, connection, the feeling of being in flow? Get specific, drill down, find the root. Stage 2, grieve. This is the step most people skip. They want to jump straight from identification to action, but Jung insisted, you must grieve what you lost. You must feel the sadness, the anger, the regret. You must give yourself permission to mourn the unlived life. If you skip this step, the grief will sabotage you. It will emerge as resentment, bitterness, or self-destruction. So feel it fully, completely. Let yourself cry if you need to. Let yourself rage if you need to. And then, when you've felt it fully, let it transform into something else. Stage 3, reimagine. Now you ask, how can I fulfill this essence in my current life? Not in some fantasy version of my life where I'm 25 again with no responsibilities, but in my actual, real, current life. What would it look like to reclaim creativity, to express this part of myself, to develop this talent? Brainstorm, get creative. There are always more options than you think. Stage 4, embody. This is where you take action, small action at first, manageable action. You don't have to quit your job or blow up your life. You start with 30 minutes, 1 hour, one choice that honors the unlived life. And then you repeat, again and again, until it's integrated, until it's part of your identity, not just a hobby or a guilty pleasure. Now, I need to tell you something difficult, something Jung would insist I tell you. You may be thinking, but it's too late, I'm too old, I missed my chance. And Jung would say, you're right. You did miss your chance to live that specific version of that specific dream, but you haven't missed your chance to live the essence of it. And if you don't seize that chance now, right now at midlife, when the psyche is literally screaming at you to wake up, then you will carry the unlived life to your grave, and it will destroy you long before you die. You'll become bitter, resentful, one of those people who can't stand to see others pursuing their dreams because it reminds you of what you gave up. You'll project your regret onto your children, your spouse, your co-workers. You'll become a walking warning, a ghost of potential that was never realized. Is that what you want, to be a cautionary tale? Or do you want to be the person who woke up, who faced the terrifying truth of what they'd abandoned and found the courage to reclaim it? Jung put it this way, the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. But privilege implies choice. It implies agency. You have to choose it. You have to reach out and take it, even when it's terrifying, even when it's inconvenient, even when everyone around you thinks you're crazy. Because the alternative, the unlived life, the slow suffocation of the soul, is so much worse than any temporary chaos or discomfort. I want to share something personal with you. A moment from my own life that forced me to confront this. I spent the first 15 years of my career doing exactly what I was supposed to do. I got the right degrees, I built the right resume. I said yes to every opportunity that looked good on paper, and I was successful, at least by external measures. But in my early 40s, something broke. I started waking up at 3 in the morning with a feeling I couldn't name. A sense of wrongness, like I was living someone else's life, reading from someone else's script. I had a dream during this period that I still remember vividly. I was standing in front of a massive library, floor to ceiling, thousands of books, and I was searching desperately for one specific book. I knew it was there somewhere, but I couldn't find it. Finally, I pulled one book off the shelf. When I opened it, it was completely blank. No words, no story, nothing. I woke up in a panic, and I knew, not intellectually, but in my body, what the dream meant. My story was blank. I was living someone else's narrative, someone else's expectations, and the book I was searching for, my book, my story, the unique myth I was supposed to be living, I'd never even started writing it. That dream was my psyche's emergency broadcast, my unlived life demanding to be acknowledged. It took me 2 years to make the changes I needed to make, to reclaim the parts of myself I'd exiled, to start living from essence instead of from persona. And it wasn't easy. There was grief, there was fear, there were people who didn't understand, who thought I was having a breakdown, but I wasn't breaking down, I was breaking through. And on the other side, and I'm still on the other side, still doing the work every day, there's a kind of aliveness I didn't know was possible, a sense of integrity, of wholeness, of living from the inside out instead of the outside in. That's what reclaiming the unlived life gives you. Not perfection, not a fantasy, but authenticity, the feeling of being aligned with your deepest self. So here's what I want you to do. Right now, before you move on to the next chapter, before you distract yourself with something else, I want you to choose one thing from your unlived life inventory. Just one. And I want you to commit, out loud if possible, or in the comments below, to taking one small action toward reclaiming its essence. Not tomorrow, not next week, today. What would that look like? If your unlived dream was to be a writer, commit to writing for 10 minutes today. If your abandoned talent was music, commit to listening to music, really listening, not as background noise, and letting yourself feel what it stirs in you. If your sacrificed relationship was with a friend you lost touch with, commit to sending them a message, not a long message. Just, I was thinking about you. I miss our connection. If your exiled self-expression was emotional vulnerability, commit to telling one person, your partner, your friend, your therapist, one true thing about how you're really feeling. One small action today. Because the unlived life isn't reclaimed through grand gestures. It's reclaimed through small, consistent choices, through showing up, through saying yes to the parts of yourself you've been saying no to for decades. Jung said, I am not what happened to me. I am what I choose to become. You can't change your past. You can't undo your choices. But you can choose, right now, today, to stop abandoning yourself, to stop trading authenticity for approval, to stop letting fear write your story. The unlived life is terrifying to confront. Jung was right about that. But you know what's more terrifying? Reaching the end of your life and realizing you never lived it at all. Don't let that be your story. You're at the threshold now, 45, the afternoon of life, and the sun is starting to set. But there's still time. There's still light. The question is, what are you going to do with it? Let me tell you something that might make you uncomfortable. Your awakening, this midlife transformation you're going through, this reclamation of your authentic self, this integration of your shadow, is not just a personal journey. It's a political act, a revolutionary act, an act of defiance against the collective unconscious itself. And society knows it. Even if society doesn't consciously understand what you're doing, it feels the threat you represent, and it will respond accordingly. Let me explain what I mean. Carl Jung spent decades studying what he called the collective shadow, the sum total of all the repressed, denied, and disowned content of an entire culture. While your personal shadow contains the parts of yourself you've exiled, the collective shadow contains the parts that an entire society has exiled. And just like your personal shadow, The collective shadow doesn't just disappear because we ignore it. It grows, it intensifies, and eventually it erupts, usually in catastrophic ways. Wars, genocide, mass movements of hatred and scapegoating. The horrors of the 20th century that Jung witnessed firsthand. But here's what Jung realized, and what most people still don't understand. The collective shadow requires participants. It needs individuals who remain unconscious, who project their shadow outward onto others, who participate in mass delusions and agreed-upon lies. And when you wake up at midlife, when you integrate your personal shadow, when you reclaim your unlived life, when you stop identifying with your persona, you withdraw your participation from the collective shadow. You stop playing the game, and that makes you dangerous. Think about it. What are the core delusions of modern Western society? The agreed-upon lies that everyone pretends to believe? That consumption equals happiness, that busyness equals worthiness, that youth equals superiority, that material success equals fulfillment, that external validation equals self-worth, that achievement equals meaning. Every single one of these is a lie, a necessary lie, perhaps, for maintaining the economic and social order, but a lie nonetheless. And for the first 45 years of your life, chances are you participated in these lies. You chased the promotions, you accumulated the possessions, you performed the persona, you posted the carefully curated highlights on social media, you competed in the status games, you subscribed to the cult of productivity. You were a good citizen of the collective ego. But at midlife, when you integrate your shadow, something shifts. You start to see through the lies. Not intellectually, you probably always knew they were lies on some level, but viscerally, in your bones, in your soul, you become immune to manipulation. You stop needing the validation. You stop chasing the carrots. You stop fearing the sticks. And suddenly, you're free. Free from the invisible chains that keep most people obedient, compliant, endlessly striving for goals that someone else defined for them. Do you understand what a threat that is? Jung wrote extensively about this in his later work. He called it individuation in the collective context, and he was fascinated by why societies seem designed to prevent individuation rather than encourage it. The answer, he realized, is that individuation threatens the collective persona, the mask that society itself wears, the agreed-upon narrative about who we are and what we value. Every culture has a collective persona. America's collective persona, for example, is the land of opportunity, the American dream, freedom, and democracy. These are the stories we tell ourselves and the world. But underneath is the collective shadow, the genocide of indigenous peoples, the legacy of slavery, the ongoing exploitation, the environmental destruction, the worship of profit over people, the violence exported around the world. We don't like to look at that. Most Americans don't like to look at that. So we keep the collective persona intact through various mechanisms, patriotic rituals, mythologizing history, projecting our shadow onto other nations. They're the evil ones, not us. And most insidiously, keeping individuals so busy, so distracted, so focused on their personal survival and advancement that they never have time to question the system itself. This is what Jung called mass psychology, and it works the same way in every culture, every society, every era. The collective wants you to remain unconscious. It wants you chasing carrots. It wants you identified with your persona. It wants you projecting your shadow onto convenient scapegoats. Other races, other religions, other political parties, other nations, so that you never turn that critical eye inward toward the system itself. Because if enough people wake up, if enough people complete their individual shadow work and withdraw their participation from the collective shadow, the entire system begins to crack. That's why your midlife awakening is threatening. That's why people react so strongly when you start to change. Let me tell you what this looks like in practice. What happens when you actually start withdrawing from the collective delusions? You stop caring about status symbols, the car, the house, the job title. They still have practical value, but they don't define you anymore. You're not impressed by someone's Tesla or their corner office or their vacation photos. You see through it. You see the emptiness underneath the performance. And people can feel it. They can feel that you're not playing the game anymore, and it makes them uncomfortable. You stop pretending to be busy. You're not constantly hustling, not constantly performing productivity. When someone asks, "How are you?" you don't reflexively say, "Busy, so busy," as if busyness were a virtue. You might say, "I'm well, I'm present, I'm focused on what matters." And people judge you for it. They think you're not ambitious enough, not driven enough. They wonder what's wrong with you. You stop participating in collective outrage. When everyone is furiously angry about whatever the media is telling them to be angry about this week, you're not automatically swept up in it. You can see the projection. You can see how the collective is using external enemies to avoid looking at its own shadow, and people call you cynical, disengaged, privileged. You stop worshiping youth. You're not trying to look younger, act younger, be younger. You're comfortable in your age. You value wisdom over novelty, depth over stimulation, presence over distraction, and society has no idea what to do with you. Because our entire consumer economy is built on making people feel inadequate about aging, you start speaking uncomfortable truths, not aggressively, not self-righteously, but simply, calmly, without need for approval. You call out the lies. You name what others are thinking but won't say. You refuse to participate in the polite fiction, and people avoid you. They stop inviting you to things. They say you've changed. They say you're not fun anymore. Does this sound familiar? If you're going through midlife awakening, I guarantee you've experienced some version of this. You've felt the social pressure, the subtle, and sometimes not so subtle, punishment for stepping out of line, for not playing the game, for refusing to participate in the collective delusions. It's lonely. I won't pretend it's not. Jung himself experienced this acutely after his break with Freud, after his own midlife confrontation with the unconscious. Jung became persona non grata in the psychoanalytic community. His colleagues thought he was crazy. They dismissed his work as mysticism, as unscientific, as dangerous. For years, Jung was isolated, professionally, socially. Even his own family worried about his sanity. But he persisted, because he knew something that his critics didn't. He had touched something real, something true, something that couldn't be unseen once you'd seen it. And eventually, decades later, his work was vindicated. Now we recognize Jung as one of the most influential psychologists of all time. But during his midlife crisis, he was considered a heretic. That's the price of individuation. That's the cost of withdrawing from the collective shadow. You become an outsider, a stranger in your own culture, but you also become free. Now, I want to be very clear about something. This doesn't mean you become a nihilist. This doesn't mean you reject all social connection or responsibility. That's not individuation. That's just another form of unconsciousness, just the shadow in a different costume. Jung was emphatic about this. True individuation doesn't separate you from the collective. It transforms your relationship with the collective. Instead of being unconsciously identified with the collective, swept up in its currents, possessed by its complexes, you become consciously connected to it. You can participate in society without being possessed by society. You can work a job without identifying as your job. You can engage with politics without being possessed by political rage. You can participate in your culture without being defined by your culture. You become what Jung called the conscious individual in the collective context. You're in the world, but not of it. You're connected, but not entangled. And this is crucial. You become capable of serving the collective in a way that unconscious people never can. Because when you're no longer driven by personal ambition, by need for validation, by fear of rejection, when you've integrated your shadow and reclaimed your unlived life, you can finally ask the question that defines the second half of life. What am I here to give? What is mine to do? How can I serve the evolution of consciousness itself? This is what Jung meant by the elder archetype. Every wisdom tradition in history has recognized that elders, people who have completed their ego work, who have integrated their shadow, who have undergone the death and rebirth of midlife initiation, these people are essential for the health of the collective. They're the wisdom keepers, the truth tellers, the ones who can hold the tension between opposites without collapsing into either extreme, the ones who can see through the collective delusions without becoming cynical or despairing. Our modern culture has forgotten this. We've created a society that worships youth and dismisses elders. We've created a culture where people over 45 are considered past their prime, where midlife is seen as decline rather than ascension. But that's a symptom of our collective shadow, our terror of aging, our worship of the persona, our fear of depth, of complexity, of the inner journey that midlife demands. And every person who completes that journey, every person who faces their shadow at midlife and emerges transformed, is a living refutation of that lie. You become proof that there's another way. So let's talk about what you're up against. Let's name the specific mechanisms that society uses to keep you unconscious, to prevent your individuation, to punish your awakening. Mechanism 1. Consumer culture. Advertising is shadow projection weaponized. Every ad is designed to make you feel inadequate, not thin enough, not successful enough, not young enough, not attractive enough, and then offer you a product as the solution. But the solution never works, because the inadequacy isn't real, it's manufactured. It's the collective shadow telling you that something is wrong with you, when actually what's wrong is the system itself. At midlife, when you integrate your shadow, you see through this. You stop believing the lie of inadequacy, and when you stop believing it, you stop buying. You stop consuming mindlessly. You stop trying to purchase your way to worthiness, and that makes you a threat to the entire economic model. Mechanism 2. Achievement culture. Our society is obsessed with achievement, with measurable success, with climbing the ladder, reaching the next level, accumulating more. This keeps you externally focused. It keeps you striving. It keeps you too busy to ask the deeper questions. What am I actually achieving? Who am I becoming in the process? Is this ladder leaning against the right wall? At midlife, you start asking those questions. And when you do, you might realize that everything you've achieved means nothing if you've lost yourself in the process. And that realization that all your achievements are empty if you're not living authentically, that's terrifying to people who are still identified with their achievements. Your presence reminds them of what they're avoiding. Mechanism 3. Social media. Social media is the collective persona on steroids. It's everybody performing their best self, their most successful self, their most curated self. It's a competition for validation, for likes, for followers, for the illusion of significance. And it's incredibly effective at keeping people unconscious, because you're so busy performing your persona, so busy comparing yourself to others' personas, that you never have time for the inner work. At midlife, when you start integrating your shadow, you become less interested in performing. You post less, you care less about likes. You're less concerned with crafting the perfect image, and people notice. They wonder what happened to you, why you're not engaging anymore, and your absence is a mirror for their own exhaustion with the performance. The music maintains its dark, contemplative tone. Mechanism 4. Busyness as virtue. Our culture has made busyness a moral virtue. If you're not overwhelmed, not stretched thin, not constantly juggling multiple responsibilities, then somehow you're not trying hard enough. You're not valuable enough. This is perhaps the most insidious mechanism of all because it disguises itself as responsibility, as work ethic, as caring about your family, your career, your commitments. But Jung would say, busyness is often a defense against depth. It's a way to avoid the inner confrontation. If you're constantly doing, you never have time for being. If you're always in motion, you never have to stop and ask, who am I when I'm not performing? What do I actually want? What does my soul need? At midlife, when the psyche demands that confrontation, you have to slow down. You have to create space. You have to disappoint people. You have to say no. You have to prioritize your inner work over external demands. And society punishes you for it. You're called selfish, lazy, uncommitted. People who are still running on the hamster wheel resent your exit. Your stillness is a mirror for their exhaustion. Mechanism 5. The fear of aging. This is the big one. The collective shadow's primary weapon in our culture. We've created a society that treats aging as a disease to be cured, a problem to be solved, a tragedy to be avoided at all costs. Billions of dollars are spent every year on anti-aging products, cosmetic procedures, medications, anything that promises to keep you looking young, feeling young, being young. Why? Because aging reminds us of death, and death is the ultimate shadow, the ultimate thing we don't want to look at. But Jung said, the afternoon of life must have a significance of its own and cannot be merely a pitiful appendage to life's morning. Midlife isn't decline, it's transformation. It's the shift from ego expansion to soul deepening, from outer achievement to inner integration, from performing to embodying. But you can't make that shift if you're terrified of aging. If you're spending all your energy trying to stay 35, you can't embrace what 45 has to offer. At midlife, when you integrate your shadow, you make peace with aging. Not in a resigned way, not, oh well, I guess I'm getting old, but in a profound, soulful way. You recognize that your wrinkles are a map of your experience, that your gray hair is earned wisdom, that your slower pace is not deterioration but depth. And when you embody that, when you move through the world comfortable in your aging, not apologizing for it, not hiding it, you become a radical act of resistance against the collective shadow. You terrify people who are still running from their own aging. Your acceptance is a mirror for their terror. I want to tell you about a conversation I had recently that brought all of this into stark relief. I was at a dinner party, one of those professional networking events that I used to find energizing but now mostly find exhausting, and I was talking with a woman who, like me, was in her mid-40s. She was a successful entrepreneur, clearly intelligent, clearly accomplished. But there was something brittle about her, something performative. She kept steering the conversation toward her achievements, her busy schedule, her upcoming projects. And every third sentence was some variation of, I know I should slow down, but at one point she asked me what I was working on, and I made the mistake of being honest. I said, right now, I'm mostly working on myself, doing a lot of inner work, shadow integration, trying to figure out who I am when I'm not performing. The temperature in the conversation dropped immediately. She looked at me like I'd just announced I was joining a cult. Oh, she said, with that particular tone that means I'm judging you but trying to sound neutral. That's nice. Must be nice to have that kind of time. And there it was, the collective speaking through her, the collective that cannot allow the possibility that slowing down, turning inward, prioritizing soul over status, that any of that might be not just valid but necessary, because if it's necessary, if midlife really does demand this kind of inner work, then she'd have to face what she's avoiding. She'd have to admit that her busyness is a defense, that her achievements aren't enough, that the ladder she's climbing might be against the wrong wall. So instead, she judged me. She made my choice wrong so hers could be right. And I understood, because I've been her. I've been the person so identified with achievement, so terrified of slowing down, that I had to judge anyone who stepped off the treadmill. That's how the collective shadow maintains itself. Through judgment, through shame, through making individuation look like failure, like self-indulgence, like giving up. Pause. But here's what I wanted to tell her and couldn't, because she wasn't ready to hear it. Your judgment of me is information about you. Your discomfort with my choices is revealing what you're not willing to face in yourself. That's Jung's mirror principle applied at the collective level. When society judges the individuating person, it's actually revealing the collective shadow. The judgment is the projection. So what do you do with this? How do you navigate your individual awakening in a society that punishes it? Jung had a clear answer. You withdraw temporarily to build strength, and then you return to serve. This is the pattern he observed in every wisdom tradition, every initiatory process. The hero leaves the village, undergoes the ordeal, transforms, and then returns with the gift. You cannot stay withdrawn forever. That's not individuation. That's just spiritual bypassing, privileged isolation, another form of unconsciousness. But you also cannot stay fully engaged with the collective during your transformation. You need space. You need protection. You need what Jung called a temenos, a sacred container where the work can happen. For some people, that's therapy. For others, it's a spiritual practice. For others, it's a small circle of conscious friends who can witness and support the journey. For Michael, the lawyer from our earlier examples, his temenos was morning solitude. Every day before work, before family demands, he spent 1 hour alone, journaling, meditating, doing active imagination work. No phone, no distractions, just him and his shadow. That hour saved his life. It gave him a space where he didn't have to perform, where he could be honest about his rage, his grief, his exhaustion, where he could start differentiating his authentic self from his persona. And gradually, over months, over years, the work he did in that protected space began to transform his outer life. He became more authentic in his relationships, more boundaried with his clients, more willing to disappoint people, to say no, to prioritize his integrity over external approval. He didn't become a hermit. He didn't abandon his responsibilities, but he changed his relationship with them. He stopped being possessed by them. For Sarah, the corporate executive who reclaimed her creativity, her temenos was her tiny garage studio. That corner where she painted every morning before work became sacred space. The one place where she could be completely herself, where she could express what the corporate world had no room for. And over time, that practice transformed everything. Not just her art, but her leadership. She became more creative in her problem solving, more willing to challenge conventional thinking, more capable of holding paradox, the tension between profit and purpose, between efficiency and humanity. She became a different kind of leader, one who could see through the collective delusions while still operating effectively within the system. That's what individuation makes possible. Not escape from the collective, but transformation of your relationship with it. Now, I want to address something directly, something I know some of you are thinking, but if I do this, if I withdraw, if I stop playing the game, if I speak my truth, I'll lose everything. I'll lose my job, my relationships, my social standing. I'll end up alone. And you might be right. You might lose some things. Some relationships won't survive your transformation. Some people in your life are only there because of your persona. And when you integrate your shadow and drop the mask, they won't know what to do with the real you. That's painful. I won't minimize it. But here's what Jung would say. What you lose in the collapse of your persona, you gain tenfold in the emergence of yourself. The relationships you lose weren't real relationships. They were persona-to-persona transactions. They were built on performance, on mutual enabling of unconsciousness. The real relationships, the soul relationships, those deepen when you individuate, because now you're finally bringing your authentic self to the connection. Now there's actually someone home, not just a well-trained persona. And yes, there will be loneliness. The loneliness of the individuating person is real. Jung called it the loneliness of the pioneer. You're going where most people won't go. You're seeing what most people won't see. You're speaking truths that make people uncomfortable. But you'll also find your people. The other individuating souls, the other midlife rebels, the other people who've done the work, who've faced their shadow, who've reclaimed their unlived life. And those connections, those real, authentic, soul-level connections, are worth all the shallow relationships you had to release. Jung had a term for this, the invisible church. He believed that individuating people across the world, even if they never meet, are connected at the level of the collective unconscious. They're working on the same project, the evolution of consciousness itself. And when you do meet them, when you find your tribe of conscious elders, there's instant recognition. You don't have to explain yourself. You don't have to perform. You can just be, and that's enough. That's what waits on the other side of this lonely passage. Let me zoom out for a moment. Let me show you why this matters not just for you personally, but for the collective, for humanity, for the future. Jung lived through 2 world wars. He witnessed the Holocaust. He saw what happens when the collective shadow erupts unchecked. And he spent the latter part of his life asking, how do we prevent this? How do we stop the cycle of collective madness? And his answer was both simple and profound. Individual consciousness is the only antidote to collective unconsciousness. Every person who integrates their shadow is one less person projecting it onto others, one less person swept up in mass movements of hatred, one less person susceptible to propaganda, to scapegoating, to the dehumanization of the other. Every person who completes their individuation is one more conscious voice in the collective conversation, one more person capable of holding complexity, of seeing through simplistic narratives, of refusing to participate in collective delusions. This isn't abstract philosophy. This is urgent, practical necessity. Look at our world right now. The polarization, the rage, the inability to have conversations across difference, the retreat into tribal identities, the search for enemies to blame, the apocalyptic thinking on both ends of every spectrum. This is all collective shadow. This is what happens when millions of people are carrying unintegrated personal shadow and projecting it outward onto political opponents, onto other races, onto other nations, onto other religions. And it's accelerating. The collective shadow is intensifying because our culture has become so effective at keeping people unconscious, so effective at keeping everyone busy, distracted, performing, consuming, that we've created a massive backlog of unprocessed shadow material. And it's erupting in our politics, in our streets, in our families, in our own psyches. The only way through, the only way to prevent the collective shadow from tearing everything apart is for enough individuals to do the work, to integrate their personal shadow, to withdraw their projections, to complete their individuation. This is why your midlife awakening matters. This is why your individual transformation is a collective contribution. You're not being selfish. You're not navel-gazing or privileged or self-indulgent. You're doing the most important work there is, becoming conscious, taking responsibility for your own shadow, so you stop projecting it onto the world, integrating your unlived life so you stop demanding that others live it for you. Every person who does this work makes the collective a little more conscious, a little more capable of facing its own shadow without destroying itself in the process. Jung believed this with absolute conviction. The future of humanity depends on whether enough individuals are willing to do this work. Not governments, not institutions, not leaders or movements or ideologies, individuals like you, willing to face the terrifying truth of themselves, willing to integrate what they've denied, willing to become conscious even when it's lonely, even when it's punished, even when society tells them they're wrong. I'm going to tell you something that might sound grandiose, but I believe it's true. If you're watching this video, if you're going through midlife awakening, if you're feeling the call to integrate your shadow and reclaim your unlived life, you're part of an evolutionary vanguard. You're one of the people who's willing to go first, to do the work that most people won't do, to become conscious in a culture that profits from unconsciousness. And that's not an accident. Jung believed in what he called synchronicity, meaningful coincidences. The fact that you're here right now encountering these ideas at this moment in your life, that's not random. The psyche called you here. The collective unconscious is recruiting you because the world needs conscious elders. Desperately, urgently, we need people who've done their shadow work, who can't be manipulated by fear or greed or the promise of status. We need people who've reclaimed their unlived life, who aren't trying to force their children or their subordinates to live it for them. We need people who've completed the death and rebirth of midlife, who understand that there's something more important than ego achievement. We need wisdom keepers, truth tellers, shadow integrators, people who can hold complexity without collapsing into simplistic answers. We need elders, and that's what you're becoming, whether you feel ready or not, whether you think you're qualified or not. The afternoon of your life isn't a decline. It's an ascension to a different kind of power, not the power of ego, not the power of achievement or status or control, the power of presence, of authenticity, of integrated wholeness, the power to look at the collective shadow without being possessed by it, to name what others won't name, to stand in the fire without being consumed. That's what awaits you on the other side of this transformation. So yes, your individual awakening threatens society. Yes, you'll be punished for it. Yes, it's lonely, but you're not doing this for society's approval. You're doing it because your soul demands it, because the psyche won't let you sleepwalk through the second half of life, because something deeper than ego is calling you toward wholeness. And in doing that, in answering that call, in facing your shadow, in reclaiming your unlived life, you're not just transforming yourself, you're transforming the collective. Every conscious person shifts the balance, adds weight to the side of awareness, makes it slightly easier for the next person to wake up. Your awakening gives others permission to awaken. Your authenticity gives others permission to be authentic. Your integration of shadow gives others permission to face their own shadow. This is how consciousness evolves, not through grand social movements or political revolutions, though those have their place, but through individual transformation, one person at a time, rippling outward. Jung called this the moral achievement of individuation, and he meant both meanings of that word. It's an ethical accomplishment, becoming responsible for your own shadow, and it's a moral imperative. It's what you owe to the collective for the gift of consciousness itself. You didn't ask to be born. You didn't ask to be conscious. But now that you are, now that you're capable of self-reflection, of choice, of transformation, you have a responsibility, not to be perfect, not to save the world, but to do your work, to integrate your shadow, to reclaim your unlived life, to become as conscious as you're capable of becoming. That's your contribution, that's your service, that's your sacred purpose in the second half of life. Long pause. So when people judge you for changing, when society pressures you to conform, to stay unconscious, to keep playing the game, remember, you're not here to make them comfortable. You're here to become conscious. And in doing so, you're lighting a path for everyone who comes after you. All right, we've spent 8 chapters exploring the territory, the forbidden threshold, the unlived life, the collective shadow. We've diagnosed the problem. We've named the forces working against you. Now it's time to do the work. Because understanding Jung's ideas intellectually is one thing. Actually transforming your psyche, that's something else entirely. Jung was emphatic about this. Psychology isn't meant to be studied. It's meant to be practiced. It's meant to be lived. He once said, "Learn your theories as well as you can, but put them aside when you touch the miracle of the living soul." What I'm about to give you is a roadmap, a practical 7-stage process for navigating the second half of life, for consciously completing what Jung called the individuation process. This isn't theory. This is practice. This is what you actually do day by day, choice by choice, to integrate your shadow, reclaim your unlived life, and become who you truly are. But before we dive in, I need to give you a warning. The same warning Jung gave his patients. This process is not linear. You're not going to move neatly from stage 1 to stage 7 like climbing a ladder. Individuation is a spiral. You'll circle back. You'll revisit earlier stages with new depth. You'll think you've completed something only to discover another layer waiting underneath. That's not failure. That's how transformation works. Each iteration takes you deeper, makes you more conscious, integrates more shadow. The goal isn't to finish. The goal is to stay conscious throughout the process. Jung put it this way: individuation does not shut one out from the world, but gathers the world to oneself. You're not trying to escape life. You're trying to live it fully, consciously, authentically. So let's begin. Stage 1. Withdrawal, creating the sacred container. The first stage is the hardest for most people because it requires something our culture teaches us is selfish: pulling back. You have to withdraw energy from external pursuits, from constant achievement, from people-pleasing, from the exhausting performance of your persona, and redirect it inward. Jung called this the withdrawal of projections. But it's more than that. It's a deliberate choice to stop, to slow down, to create space for the inner work that midlife demands. This doesn't mean you quit your job or abandon your family or move to a monastery, though for some people, temporary versions of those might be necessary. For most of us, withdrawal is more subtle. It's carving out time and space for solitude, for reflection, for encountering yourself without distraction. Here's what this looks like practically. Create a daily practice of solitude. This is non-negotiable. You need at least 30 minutes, ideally an hour, every single day where you're alone, without your phone, without input, without tasks, just you and your inner world. For some people, this is early morning before the house wakes up. For others, it's late evening. Find what works for your life, but make it sacred. Protect it like you'd protect the most important meeting of your day, because it is. What do you do during this time? You could journal. Free write whatever comes up without censoring. Let the unconscious speak. You'll be surprised what emerges when you give it permission. You could practice active imagination. We'll get to that in detail in stage 2. For now, just know it involves dialoguing with inner figures, with parts of yourself that have been silenced. You could simply sit, breathe, be present with whatever you're feeling without trying to fix it or understand it or make it go away. The specific practice matters less than the commitment. You're training yourself to turn inward, to value your inner life as much as your outer achievements. Engage in therapy or depth work. If you can afford it, and I know not everyone can, find a therapist or analyst who understands Jungian psychology, someone who can help you navigate the unconscious material that's going to surface. If therapy isn't accessible, find other containers, a men's or women's group, a spiritual community, a trusted friend or mentor who's done this work themselves. You need witnesses. You need people who can mirror back what you can't see in yourself. The danger of doing this work alone is that the ego can trick you. It can make you think you're integrating shadow when you're actually just rearranging your defenses. Having someone outside your own psyche, someone trained to spot the tricks, is invaluable. Reduce your commitments. This is where withdrawal becomes visible to others, and where you'll face resistance. You have to start saying no to social obligations that drain you, to volunteer commitments you only said yes to out of guilt, to projects that feed your persona but starve your soul. This will disappoint people. They'll be upset. They'll try to guilt you into staying engaged. But we need you. You've always done this. What happened to you? And you have to be okay with that. You have to be willing to let people down in service of your own transformation. I know that's hard, especially if you've spent your whole life being the reliable one, the helper, the person everyone can count on. But Jung was clear. You cannot individuate while maintaining all your previous commitments. Something has to give. What gives is the false self, the persona, the version of you that was performing for external approval. Let it give. Let people be disappointed. Let them judge you. You're not doing this for them. You're doing it because your soul is demanding it. Michael, the lawyer we've been following, started his withdrawal by cutting his work hours from 70 per week to 50. His firm wasn't happy. His trajectory toward partners slowed. His competitive colleagues smirked, assuming he was losing his edge. But he didn't care anymore, or rather, he cared more about his inner work than about their opinions. That shift in priorities is what withdrawal creates. Every morning, 5:30 to 6:30 a.m., he sat in his home office with a journal. No email, no news, no distractions. Just him and the parts of himself he'd been exiling for decades. At first, nothing happened. He just felt uncomfortable, restless. His mind raced with tasks and worries. But he stuck with it, and gradually, over weeks, over months, something shifted. His rage started to have a voice. His grief started to have permission. The wounded parts of himself that he'd been steamrolling with achievement and productivity finally had space to speak. That's what withdrawal creates. Space for the unconscious to emerge. Sarah's withdrawal looked different. She couldn't reduce her work hours immediately. She had financial responsibilities, a family depending on her income. So she withdrew in smaller ways. She stopped checking work email after 7 p.m. She took real lunch breaks instead of eating at her desk. She resigned from 2 volunteer boards that she'd been on purely out of obligation. And she claimed her garage studio. 30 minutes every morning before work. 30 minutes where she wasn't Vice President Sarah. Where she was just Sarah. The part of her that had been buried under 2 decades of corporate performance. At first, she just stood in the studio, overwhelmed. She didn't know how to paint anymore, didn't know how to access that creative self. But she kept showing up, and eventually the paint started to flow. Not great art, not at first, but real, authentic, hers. That's what withdrawal gives you, access to the parts of yourself that the persona has been suffocating. The signs you're ready for stage 2. You'll know you've established enough withdrawal when you can be alone with yourself without constant distraction. You're no longer terrified of what you might find in the silence. You've created consistent space and time for inner work. You've accepted that some people will judge or reject your changes. You're beginning to notice material from the unconscious, dreams, emotions, insights that you couldn't access before. This stage might take months. It might take a year. Don't rush it. The container you build in stage 1 holds everything that comes after. Jung said, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." But that requires time, space, withdrawal from the noise. Give yourself that gift. Stage 2, shadow work, befriending your darkness. Now we get to the heart of it, The work that most people avoid their entire lives. The work that will transform you if you have the courage to do it. Shadow work. By now you know what the shadow is, all the parts of yourself you've denied, repressed, or disowned. The qualities you judged as unacceptable. The desires you were taught to be ashamed of. The emotions you learned weren't okay to feel. But knowing about the shadow intellectually and actually integrating it, that's the difference between reading about swimming and jumping in the water. Jung said, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. Shadow work is making the unconscious conscious. It's bringing what's been hidden into the light. Not to judge it, not to eliminate it, but to integrate it, to reclaim it, to take back the energy and vitality that's been locked in those exiled parts. Here's how you do it. Active imagination, dialoguing with the shadow. This is Jung's signature technique. It sounds strange if you've never done it, but it's incredibly powerful. You're going to have a conversation with your shadow, not metaphorically. Actually, find a quiet place where you won't be interrupted. Sit comfortably, close your eyes if it helps, and invite your shadow to speak. You might say something like, I'm ready to meet you. I'm ready to hear what I've been refusing to hear. Please show yourself. And then you wait. You pay attention. You notice what emerges. It might be an image, a feeling, a voice, a memory, a part of yourself that feels threatening or shameful or powerful. Don't judge it. Don't try to control it. Just witness it. And then, and this is crucial, you dialogue with it. You ask it questions. Who are you? What do you want? What have I been refusing to see? What gift are you trying to bring me? And you listen. You write down what comes. Not what you think should come, what actually comes. The shadow often speaks in images, in metaphors, in emotions rather than words. That's okay. Let it speak in its own language. Michael did this work and encountered a part of himself he called the beast, a figure that was all rage, all violence, all the anger he'd been repressing for decades to be a good man, a professional. At first, he was terrified of the beast. It felt dangerous, uncontrollable, everything he'd been taught not to be. But as he dialogued with it, something shifted. The beast wasn't trying to destroy him. It was trying to protect him. It was the part of him that knew how to say no, how to set boundaries, how to defend himself against exploitation. He'd exiled it because he thought anger was wrong. But what he'd actually exiled was his own power, his own sovereignty. Integrating the beast didn't mean becoming violent. It meant reclaiming his ability to be assertive, to stand up for himself, to stop being exploited by clients and colleagues who sensed his inability to push back. That's what shadow integration does. It gives you back your power, the power you exiled because you thought it was dangerous, but which is actually essential for wholeness. Shadow mapping, tracking your projections. The second technique is what I call shadow mapping. You're going to systematically identify your shadow by tracking your projections. Remember, whatever you judge intensely in others is usually a disowned part of yourself. So make a list. Write down 5 to 10 people who trigger you, people you judge harshly, people who irritate you disproportionately. For each person, identify specifically what qualities you're judging. She's so selfish. He's so emotional. They're so lazy. She's so aggressive. He's so needy. Got your list? Good. Now comes the hard part. For each quality you've judged, ask yourself, where does this quality exist in me, even in a different form? The workaholic who judges lazy people. Where are you lazy? Maybe not in work, but in relationships, in self-care, in emotional availability. The stoic who judges emotional people. Where are you emotional? Maybe you don't cry, but do you rage? Do you withdraw? Emotion doesn't just mean sadness. The self-reliant person who judges needy people. Where are you needy? Maybe not for practical help, but for validation, for control, for certainty. This is confrontational work. Your ego will resist it. It will insist, no, I'm not like that at all. They're the problem, not me. But that resistance is the signal. That's exactly where you need to look. Write it out. Force yourself to find the connection, even if it feels untrue at first, especially if it feels untrue. Sarah did this work with her intense judgment of selfish women. Women who prioritized their own needs, who said no without guilt, who put themselves first. She judged them harshly, called them narcissistic, self-absorbed, bad mothers, bad partners. And then she had to face the truth. She was judging them because she desperately wanted permission to be selfish herself, to prioritize her own needs, to say no without drowning in guilt. She'd spent 20 years being the perfect caregiver, perfect employee, perfect mother, perfect daughter, and she was exhausted, resentful, dying inside. The women she judged weren't actually selfish. They just had boundaries. They just valued themselves. And she couldn't tolerate seeing that because it mirrored what she wasn't allowing herself. Integrating that shadow didn't mean abandoning her responsibilities. It meant developing healthy boundaries, learning to say no, recognizing that self-care isn't selfish, it's necessary. That one piece of shadow work transformed her life more than any amount of positive affirmations or self-help books ever could. Dream work, reading the shadow's messages. Your dreams are the shadow's primary way of communicating. Every night while your ego sleeps, the unconscious sends you messages, symbols, stories, warnings, invitations. Most people ignore their dreams. They wake up, shake them off, and jump into the day. But Jung said, who looks outside dreams, who looks inside awakes. Your dreams are trying to wake you up, to show you what you're not seeing in waking life. So start a dream journal. Keep it by your bed. The moment you wake up, before you check your phone, before you think about your day, write down whatever you remember. Don't worry about understanding it. Don't try to interpret it immediately. Just record it. Over time, patterns will emerge. Recurring symbols, recurring themes, recurring figures. Pay special attention to shadow figures in your dreams, characters who feel threatening, dangerous, or shameful. These are usually representations of your own disowned qualities. Recurring nightmares, the psyche repeating the same message because you're not getting it in waking life. Powerful emotions, dreams where you wake up feeling intense rage, grief, fear, or desire, often point to shadow material. You don't need to be a Jungian analyst to work with your dreams. You just need to pay attention, to ask, what is this dream trying to tell me? What part of myself am I not seeing? And then, and this is key, you bring the dream into active imagination. You dialogue with the dream figures. You ask them what they represent. Michael had a recurring dream during his shadow work. He was being chased by a massive black dog. Terrifying, relentless. No matter how fast he ran, it kept gaining on him. Initially, he thought it was just anxiety, stress from work. But when he finally stopped running in the dream, when he turned around and faced the dog, everything changed. The dog didn't attack him. It sat, looked at him. And in that moment, Michael understood. The dog was his own instinct, his own wildness, the part of him that wasn't civilized, that wasn't performing, that was just raw, authentic animal. He'd been running from it his whole life, trying to be completely rational, completely controlled, completely professional. But the dog kept chasing him because it needed to be integrated. It was part of him. And until he acknowledged it, claimed it, gave it space, it would haunt him. After that dream, Michael started running, actual running, physical running, not for fitness, for release, for embodiment, for connecting to that instinctual animal part of himself that the corporate world had no room for. That's what dream work does. It gives you access to parts of yourself that waking consciousness can't reach.